Two Faces of George Bush. Two Faces of George Bush by Anthony C. Sutton. Contents: the official face of George Bush. Establishment links of George Bush: Bonesman Bush, the oil man, fast track Bush, internationalist anti-American Bush, the extremist where Bush money comes from, smoking guns Bush and the wimp factor Bush, drug overlord. Hush. The Politician, Appendix A, by the same author. National suicide, military aid to the Soviet Union, Wall Street and the rise of Hitler, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, The Order series, an introduction to the Order, how the Order controls education, how the Order creates war and revolution, secret cult of the Order. Chapter 1, The Official Face of George Bush. This is the unauthorized biography of Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush. This version has very little in common with the official version, very little that the Vice President and his paid press hacks want you to know. In fact, we doubt you will find one half of our material in any official or authorized Bush biography. Oddly, we have no objection to this state of affairs. We don't like politicians much anyways. Whether politicians are tagged left or right, liberal or conservative, it doesn't seem to make much difference. And, after all, how would researchers and hunters make a living if public relations flacks told the truth and only the truth about their clients? As long as PR flacks do their jobs, then muckrakers can enjoy the challenge of filling in the memory hole. Today muckrakers are far more highly esteemed and probably far more widely believed than the public relations people. When it comes to Vice President George Bush, the official public relations blurb reads like perfection personified. Only an egotist supreme would allow it to be printed. Bush is a devoted family man, a war hero, a Yale Phi Beta Kappa, a successful businessman, a real politician, not one of those cheap two-faced scoundrels, a statesman you can trust, former director of the CIA and privy to all manner of state secrets, an old China hand, a diplomat, our top negotiator, a charming well-spoken man from an old line American family, even acting President of the United States for several hours in 1985. This is the official face of George Bush. And probably there are some dear souls out there who actually believe this line. The other face of George Bush is not to be found in White House press releases. This book is about the unspoken part. Two Faces of George Bush, the part that we think people really want to hear, the skeletons in the closet. Not that all the unprinted is bad, but the fact that the PR people can't resist painting a perfect portrait makes them vulnerable. Even mildly critical episodes take on dramatic urgency if concealed. So the concealed segment that you will find here is not going to help Mr. Bush in the forthcoming election. But that's not our problem, it's Mr. Bush's problem. We have nothing against the gentleman personally. Only that we consider Bush to be totally unqualified to be President of the United States. And, if the reader checks our facts and considers our argument, he or she may well come to the same conclusion. In brief, and this is the core of our argument, Mr. Bush is a two-faced wimp, beholden to establishment and special interests, especially oil interests, a hypocrite willing to make a deal with almost any political, religious or economic faction that may serve a political purpose, and not too fast in thinking on his feet. Without family and establishment backing, George Bush just couldn't make it in mainstream America. The face of George Bush is also the face of your local bank loan officer, your attorney, your local health inspector or high school teacher, certainly not President of the United States. The official biography 0F George Bush. Let's start with the official White House biography of George Bush, reproduced here in full with nothing omitted, as issued in March 1987, updated in August 1985 to include the fact that Bush was, for several hours, President of the United States on July 13, 1985. Vice President George Bush. On January 20, 1981. George Bush was sworn in as the 43rd Vice President of the United States. On January 20, 1985, he was sworn in to serve a second term. Vice President Bush serves as President of the United States Senate and as a close advisor to the President. As the only nationally elected official in the government besides the President, The Vice President provides confidential advice to the President on a full range. The official face of George Bush. 4. X. The official face of George Bush, of issues facing the government. In June of 1985, the Vice President was named to coordinate the administration's activities to combat international terrorism. He previously headed similar efforts on deregulation and drug interdiction. At the President's direction, the Vice President has traveled to 64 foreign countries to consult with world leaders on matters of bilateral and international concern. George Herbert Walker Bush was born in Milton, Massachusetts, on June 12, 1924. He graduated from Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, in June of 1942, and on his 18th birthday he enlisted in the U.S. Navy Reserve as a seaman second class. Receiving his wings and commission while still 18, Bush became the youngest pilot in the U.S. Navy at the time. On active duty from August 1942 to September 1945, he flew torpedo bombers off the USS San Jacinto, fighting in the Pacific Theater. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and 3 Air Medals. He entered Yale University when he returned home. He was captain of the varsity baseball team, earned his degree in economics, 4, Two Faces of George Bush, and graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1948. After graduation, Mr. Bush moved to Texas where he worked as a trainee and then as a supply salesman for Dresser Industries in West Texas and California from 1948 to 1950. He co-founded a small royalty firm, Bush Overby Development Company, in 1951. In 1953, he co-founded Zapata Petroleum Corporation, and 1 year later, at the age of 30, Mr. Bush became president and co-founder of a third firm, Zapata Offshore Company. The fledgling firm pioneered in experimental offshore drilling equipment. Today, the rigs that Zapata pioneered drill for much of the energy produced around the world. This entrepreneurial experience was the foundation for the Vice President's interest in the development of high-technology industries. He has visited high-tech facilities in America, applauding the risk-takers responsible for so much of the country's economic growth and new job opportunities. Mr. Bush was elected to the United States House of Representatives from Texas' 7th District in 1966. He was one of the few freshman members of Congress ever selected to serve on the Ways and Means Committee and was re-elected without opposition 2 years later. During his congressional service, he was active in legislation dealing with problems of excessive government spending and inflation, national defense, civil rights, quality education, natural resources and environmental matters. He served as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations from 1971 to 1973, and chairman of the Republican National Committee from January 1973 to September 1974. Beginning in October of 1974, Mr. Bush served for more than a year in Peking as Chief of the United States Liaison Office in the People's Republic of China, a sensitive and complex assignment, as the United States was beginning its new relationship with the People's Republic. In 1976 Mr. Bush was appointed Director of Central Intelligence, where he helped write the executive order that guaranteed the protection of civil rights of United States citizens. His leadership helped to restore morale and efficiency after a period of disorganization in the United States intelligence community. Today, as chairman of the Task Force on Terrorism, he continues to urge a strengthening of the intelligence capabilities of the United States. The official face of George Bush. 5. In July 1980, Mr. Bush was selected by Ronald Reagan to be his running mate at the 1980 Republican Convention. On November 4, 1980, he was elected Vice President-designate of the United States, and on January 20, 1981, he was sworn in as the 43rd Vice President of the United States. On January 20, 1985, he was sworn into a second term. He is married to the former Barbara Pierce of Rye, New York. They are the parents of 5 children: George, 39, of Midland, Texas; Jeb, 32, of Miami, Florida; Neil, 30, of Denver, Colorado; Marvin, 28, of Alexandria, Virginia, and Dorothy Bush LeBlond, 25, of Wilton, Connecticut. The Bushes have 7 grandchildren. Vice President and the Mrs. Bush are residents of Houston, Texas, and are members of St. Martin's Episcopal Church, where he is a former vestryman. He has served on the vestry of St. Anne's Episcopal Church, Kennebunkport, Maine, and is on the board of the Episcopal Church Foundation. He has been active in a wide range of civic and philanthropic concerns, and since 1972 has received 21 honorary degrees. His father, the late Prescott Bush, served as United States Senator from 1952 through .1962. August, 1985, the war hero. This bland portrayal, on the previous pages, of official facts is fleshed out by political appearances, many specially contrived, around the United States. Take for example the war hero image. Bush's military career in World War II was relatively uneventful but carries a lot of weight for image promoters. On his 18th birthday Bush enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve. After flight training at Corpus Christi, Texas, the 20-year-old Navy pilot was assigned to the 3rd and 5th Fleets in the Pacific. While serving on the light aircraft carrier USS San Jacinto, the TMB-3E Avenger torpedo bomber flown by Bush, was shot down by Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Bush promptly bailed out and was picked up 4 hours later by the U.S. submarine Finback. On July 13, 1985, Vice President Bush was named acting President of the United States for several hours in an historic transfer of authority from President Reagan under the 25th Amendment to the Constitution. Two faces of George Bush. Bush was discharged in 1945 with the rank of Lieutenant Junior grade and some medals. This portrayal has been pushed scores of times into the media under various excuses to pump up the Bush the war hero image. For example, on September 3, 1984, this relatively minor episode in the Pacific was converted into an anniversary at Norfolk Naval Base. Bush was photographed waving from a vintage Avenger and took the opportunity to make an "I was there" speech. In the speech Bush reminded his naval audience, "I think all of us who have seen combat know how important the technological edge is. When you have to go up there alongside the enemy and alone against the enemy, you don't want someone to be cutting corners on the equipment." In fact, of course, Bush had an easy military career compared to millions of others who stay silent about their suffering and hardship during not only World War II, but Korea and Vietnam. All brought about by the same establishment that produced George Bush. Ann Lewis, political director of the Democratic National Committee, criticized the above Norfolk Naval Base episode well. "I think events like this for the purpose of a national campaign trivialize the very values that they claim to defend. That says it all. That a politician would order a special Navy anniversary organized to trumpet his own brief military endeavors is trivial and hypocritical indeed. A Douglas MacArthur would do no such thing because a Douglas MacArthur has sufficient stature to make public strutting and parading unnecessary." Chapter 2, Establishment Links of George Bush. The Bush family comes from an old line Connecticut lineage with connections to Wall Street international bankers and oil interests. Father of George Bush, Prescott Sheldon Bush, was born in Columbus, Ohio, May 15, 1895, son of manufacturer Samuel Prescott and Flora Sheldon Bush. Prescott Sheldon Bush attended St. George's Preschool in Newport, Rhode Island, and graduated from Yale University. At Yale, Prescott Bush was initiated into the secret powerful fraternity Skull and Bones, the Prescott Bush Club of 1917 being one of the most influential and successful clubs, as the initiation groups are called, in history of Skull and Bones. Prescott Bush started his business career with Simmons Hardware of St. Louis, Missouri. From 192,224 Bush worked with Stedman Products, and from 192,426 with United States Rubber Company. In 1926 Bush joined the international banking firm of Wa. Harriman, later Brown Brothers Harriman, along with fellow Skull and Bones fraternity members of Earl Harriman and D. Roland Harriman. Bush later became a partner in Brown Brothers Harriman, which position he kept until his death. Thus the conservative Bush was a fraternity and business partner of the liberal Harriman family. Their common bond was internationalism. Among other companies, Prescott Bush served as a director of Columbia Broadcasting System Incorporated, the Prudential Company of America, Dresser Industries Incorporated, Hydrocarbon Research Incorporated, Union Banking Corporation more later, Vanadium Corporation of America and the U.S. Guaranty Trust. On election to the U.S. Senate from Connecticut in 1952, Prescott Bush resigned all these corporate positions. He was 1. Establishment links of George Bush R.C., elected in 1962. During World War I, Bush served as a captain in the 322 Field Regiment of the U.S. Army Field Artillery. Oddly 322, his regiment number, is also the chapter designation for Skull and Bones at Yale. Each Skull and Bones cell contains 15 members sworn to secrecy. Another fellow initiate with Prescott Bush was Henry Neil Mallon, president of Dresser Industries, one of the key companies in building up the Soviet Union. Mallon was also an officer in the Field Artillery in 1917, a captain in the 323rd Field Artillery. Below is the membership list from Skull and Bones catalog. This is the cell of 1917 including Prescott Bush and D. Roland Larman. 1917 Eleanor, A. Tar, Bush, P.S. Cooper, H. 517, Cunningham, 0,13. Durai, S.S. Harriman, Lesham, H.P. James, E.S. Legore, H.W. Mallon, H.N. Olson, A.W. Overton, L.W. Shepard, F.P. Simpson, K.1. Woolley, K. Henry Peter Lesham, a fellow initiate of Bush in the 1917 Skull and Bones Club, was also a director of Dresser Industries as well as director of Marshall Field and First National Bank of Chicago. John Chipman Farrar, chairman of the publishers Farrar and Reinhardt Incorporated, was also a fellow initiate in this same 1917 Prescott Bush cell. So was Artemus Gates, president of the New York Trust Company, Union Pacific, Time, Boeing Company and other major corporations. Gates was also Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Air in 1941 and Under Secretary of the Navy for part of 1945. 10. Two Faces of George Bush. Yet another initiate in the Bush cell was Frank Parsons Shepard, long time with Guaranty Trust and then Bankers Trust Company. Shepard was also chairman of the Finance Committee of Union Theological Seminary. Another prominent financial member of the 1917 cell was Knight Woolley, whose career included $191,920 with Guaranty Trust and a partner in Brown Brothers Harriman and its predecessor from 1927 onwards. E. Roland Harriman, brother of Averell Harriman, a 1913 initiate into Skull and Bones, was a partner in Brown Brothers Harriman and W. A. Harriman since 1922. This brief listing of Prescott Bush's fraternity brothers suggests how Skull and Bones members clustered together in establishment business. In this case W. A. Harriman and C0, then Brown Brothers Harriman, Dresser Industries, and to a lesser extent Union Banking Corporation and Guaranty Trust were centers of Skull and Bones activities. The significance of these corporations is their role in the build-up of both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Dresser Industries is a prominent manufacturer of O-11 drilling equipment, vitally needed to expand Soviet oil fields, and Dresser has been in the forefront to make the USSR the #1 world oil producer, and oil is its greatest single source of foreign exchange. See Chapter 4. Guaranty Trust was an early financial link with the Soviet Union, as was W. A. Harriman and Company with its Georgian manganese concession in the 1920s. Perhaps most interesting is the role of Prescott Bush and his fellow Skull and Bones members in Union Banking Corporation and its Nazi affiliates. Adolf Hitler received his backing from foreign and domestic sources, including the Fritz Thyssen interests. When interrogated in 1945 under Project Dustbin, Wissen recalled that in 1923 he was approached by General Ludendorff. Shortly after this, Wissen was introduced to Hitler and provided funds for Nazis, conducted by Ludendorff. Through Rudolf Hess, Wissen arranged for a 250,000 mark credit for the Nazis via the Bank voor Handel en Scheepvaart NV in Rotterdam, Holland. This bank was a subsidiary of Wissen's bank, establishment links of George Bush, 11, formerly von der Heyd's Bank in Germany and affiliated with the Harriman banking interests in New York. The Dutch bank controlled the Union Banking Corporation in New York and was indeed a joint Wissen-Harriman operation with several of Prescott Bush's Skull and Bones initiates as directors. In the 1930s, Union Banking Corporation had the following directors: E. Roland Harriman, Vice President of W. A. Harriman and Company and fellow club _member 1917 of Skull and Bones with Prescott Bush. I.L.J. Kouwenhoven, Nazi banker and the managing director for the Bank voor Handel. I. G. Groningen, Nazi member of the steel cartel that also financed Hitler. Ulvens President, Union Banking Corporation, New York. _.5. James, partner of War. Harriman and fellow initiate in the Prescott Bush 1917 sale of Skull and Bones. Prescott Bush, director of Union Banking Corporation and member of Skull and Bones, same cell as E. Roland Harriman and S. James. Prescott Bush was a long-time partner in Brown Brothers Harriman. W. Averell Harriman had a long-time association with the Soviet Union. As early as 1922, Harriman, with Guarantee Trust, was financing Soviet deals. In winding up his manganese concession in 1929, Harriman received a windfall profit from the usually hard-headed Soviets. State Department officials were uncertain how to classify this gift, but from State Department files it is clear that State was unable to investigate this gift, which placed Harriman in debt to the Soviets. The conclusion is that the Harrimans and Prescott Bush were intimately associated with financing both Nazis and Soviets. Both extremes of the political spectrum. When we, 2 Faces of George Bush, come to look at George Bush's political activities, Chapter 7, we find he has the same proclivity for extremist positions while all the while claiming moderation. George Bush is therefore pure Eastern establishment, descended from that long-ruling elitist crowd of politicians, businessmen and financiers who use the revolving door to maintain a highly disproportionate influence on foreign especially and domestic policy. By every test, George Bush represents, originates from, reflects and has the limitations of America's longtime elite. The same elite has created enormous problems for the average American in the street and cost thousands of American lives. This self-perpetuating, self-preoccupied elite is long outdated. The difference between Bush and many other members of the elite is that Bush has great trouble acting out a role as a common man. Bush is distinctly uncomfortable around average people. His body language tells you everything. The chart on page 13 shows how Bush and his wife Barbara are linked to corporate establishment America. After leaving the Navy in 1946, Bush contracted what has been called a corporate merger type of marriage, popular in the 1940s and 1950s and perhaps long before, when powerful groups intermarried for power more than any other reason. George Bush married Barbara Pierce, Smith College educated, daughter of the publisher Marvin Pierce of MC Calls. It was Barbara Pierce's brother Scott Pierce, as president of B.F. Hutton, who was in the center of the H.F. Hutton check-kiting scandals that cost American investors billions of dollars over an extended period. In May 1985, Scott Pierce pled guilty to mail fraud charges. According to syndicated columnist Jack Anderson, Scott Pierce through other E.F. Hutton associates asked Vice President George Bush to intervene in the case. Given the extraordinary light nature of the sentences, there were 2,000 counts of mail fraud and no one went to prison. It sure seems as if someone with power intervened in the case. However, a crucial document to show that the vice president had lunch with his brother-in-law and discussed the case is not traceable. Chapter 3, Bonesman Bush. Without question, the single most damaging flaw in the Bush drive for the presidency is also by far the least known. George Bush is a member of a secret society whose members are sworn to absolute secrecy. They may not admit membership, nor may they even discuss membership in the presence of non-members. The secret society is Skull and Bones, founded in 1833 at Yale University. George Bush was initiated in 1948. One researcher has spent several years in an attempt to have Bush fulfill a public duty to admit this membership and so present an open book to the electorate above his oath of allegiance to a furtive secret society with apparently satanic initiation rites. Here is an extract from a report submitted by researcher Richard A. Landcomer of Houston, Texas. When I wrote to Vice President Bush regarding his membership in Skull and Bones, approximately 2 years ago, the end result was that Mr. Bush adamantly refused to either affirm or deny his membership in Skull and Bones. In the second letter dated February 9, 1984 from Vice President Bush's then acting press secretary Shirley M. Green, I was referred to Yale University directly in response to all my questions regarding VP Bush's membership in Skull and Bones. This letter also referred to Skull and Bones as a college organization. In her first letter to me dated December 13, 1983, Ms. Green alleged that Vice President Bush's public career has been conducted in great openness to the press for scrutiny of his performance. It's Ms. Green's evasive double talk that can get the VP into trouble. This writer also asked the White House about Bush membership in Skull and Bones and was informed that the VP had never belonged to a sordid secret society. Bonesman Bush, 15. However, the question was phrased as follows: was the Vice President ever a member of Skull and Bones? It was subtly, or perhaps not so subtly, rephrased to include the word sordid, not in the original question. Mr. Bush has a problem. We have in our possession the only copy of the Skull and Bones membership list outside initiated members. It is the 1983 two-volume set vertical barrel folded into living and deceased members. We reproduce parts of pages 25 and 26 with George Bush's name. Mr. Bush was sworn into the 1948 club or cell. Mr. Bush has also taken a solemn oath never to divulge or discuss membership. Which is more important, an oath to a juvenile secret society or an oath of office to the United States which requires openness with the electorate? Mr. Bush will neither admit nor deny membership. This is not enough. We say Mr. Bush is a liar if he denies membership. We also say Mr. Bush has broken his oath if he admits membership. What has George Bush promised in an oath to his fellow Ixmen in order to place their common initiation bond above the people of the United States? We reproduce on pages 17 to 21 of this chapter, pages from the secret membership list of Skull and Bones. Pages 22 and 23 indicate how seemingly persons of different political philosophies are bound together by oath in point 1 secret society. This bond presumably is tighter than the public pronouncements on ideology made by these members. Pages 188 and 189 give more information. They list the members in each club or cell from 1932 through 1949. A key point is that each club chooses the membership of the succeeding club. Club 1948 contains George Herbert Walker Bush, who with 14 fellow brothers chose the Club of 1949. The Club of 1949, 16, Two Faces of George Bush, includes Reverend W. Sloan Coffin Jr., the anti-war cleric with a decidedly offbeat revolutionary fervor, based at the old-time Riverside Church, New York. Sometimes it appears that everything stemming from Marxist revolution in the U.S. also stems from Riverside Church. The church has been host to persons ranging from the KGB, to peace movements, to Cora Weiss, whose millions finance the Institute for Policy Studies, the extremist think tank in Washington, D.C. In the same cell as Revolutionary Coffin we find Lord. Generations of Lord families have always had representatives in Skull and Bones. This lord was controller of the currency. Also P. W. Lufkin of the firm Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette. V. Van Dyne was a long-term CIA operative, as was William Sloane Coffin. All, however, are sworn by common oath not to divulge their activities. The leadership of both major parties is essentially controlled by members of Skull and Bones. As we have noted, the Bush family is Skull and Bones. Gary Hart, who was the one-time unfortunate leading Democratic candidate, is Scroll and Key, another Yale society, usually known as a weak sister of Skull and Bones. Again on the Democratic side, Senator John F. Kerry, only 2 years in the Senate, was chosen by the Senate to head the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. Kerry is Skull and Bones. The chairman of the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee was at the time of going to press Senator John Hines, also a member of Skull and Bones. In brief, the key positions, the leading candidates are members of a secret society bound together by an oath of silence. I-4, Bonesman Bush entries in the Skull and Bones Catalogue of Members. Biographical entries, pages 25 and 26. Bush, 1948, George Herbert Walker, LLD. Government, born June 12, 1924, Milton, Mass., Vice Pres. of the United States. The White House, Washington, D.C. 20501, Res. The Vice President's Residence, Washington, D.C. 20501, Pres. And CHMN, Zapata Offshore Co., 58'66, MBR, U.S. Congress, 67'70 U.S. Permanent Rep. to United Nations Ambassador 71'72, CHMN, Repub. Natl. Com. 73'74, Chief U.S. Liaison Officer. Peking People's Republic of China, 74'75, Central Intelligence, 76, Vice Pres, 81 Lieutenant J.G., USN, 42'45, DFC, 3 Air Medals, RN. Jan. 6, 45, Barbara Pierce, 5. George W., 68, John E., Neil M., Marvin P., D. Dorothy W. Bush, 1968, George Walker, MBA, Industry, BAM. July 6, 1946, New Haven, Connecticut, Pres. and Chief Exec. Officer. Bush Exploration C0, PO. Draw 10626, Midland, Texas 79702, Res. 1405 W. Golf Course, Midland, Texas 79702, CHMN, Midland Cancer Society, CHMN, Midland United Way Fund Drive, LST Lieutenant, Texas Air National Guard, 68'74, M. 1977, Laura Welch, D. Barbara Pierce, Jenna Welch. Bush, 1953, Jonathan J., MBA, Investments, born May 6, 1931, Greenwich, Connecticut, CHMN. Of the Ed. J. Bush & Co., Incorporated, 641 Lexington Avenue, New York, NY 10022, Res. 530E. 86th Street, New York, NY 10028, Co-CHMN. 20th Reunion Special Gifts, BD. Ofta. YF. Russell Reynolds Associates, Trustee, Boys Club of New York, First Lieutenant, AUS, 53'55, M. December 2, 67, Josephine Bradley, 5. Jonathan 1, Jr., William Hall. Club lists for 1948 and 1949. L. 948 Ashley, T. L. Bigelow, L.H., Jr. Bush, G. H. W. Corkins, J. E. Clark, W. J. Connolly, W. J. Jr. Cook, 6. 3. D. Grims, D. C. Jenkins, R. E. Mack, R. G. Mosley. T. W. 4. G. H. Jr., 1949. Barabald, R. P. Bassett, 3.13. 2. D. Coffin, W. S. Jr. Davison, D. P. Goodyear, R. M. Hollister, 1.13, Junior Lavely, A, Junior Lipper, J. MCC. Lippincott, D. MCC. Lord, C. E. Lufkin, P. W. Raymond, G. T. P. Sherrill, F. G. Van Dyne, V. Wickwire, W. R. Walker, 5.8, Junior Weaver, H. S. Wilkie, V. Jr., 18, Two Faces of George Bush. Pages from the secret membership list of, pages 22 and 23 include William Buckley, conservative, followed by Frederick McGeorge Bundy, liberal, uncle of McGeorge Bundy S&B 1940 and W. P. Bundy S&B 1939. 71, Vice Pres. Bob Marshall Alliance, 81, Advisor, University of Montana Rodeo Team, 81, Exec. De, RTA, 73'74, Resident PT. RTA, 77, M. June 23, 73, Linda L. Lotz, S. Dawson Scott. Brubaker, 1977, James Robert, Finance, born September 19, 1955, Woodbridge, Connecticut, Est. Vice Pres. Citicorp Corporate Banking and Acquisition and Finance. 200 S. Wanker, 32D Floor, Chicago, Ill. 60,540, Res. 820 watts. Douglas Naperville, Ill. 60,540, Class Agent, Yale Alumni Fund, 77 RTA Club Agent, 77, M. October 7, 78, Nancy Anderson, 5. Eric Britton. Brubaker, 1976, John Kim Business, born October 4, 1953, Hartford, Connecticut, Organizational Field Manager, Southern New England, Southwest & Co., P.O. Box 820, Nashville, Tennessee 37202, Res. 18 Campsite Lane, Setauket, NY 11785, in June 77, Elizabeth B. Richter 77. Bryan, 1971, James Taylor. J.D.Liu, born January 6, 1948, Glen Cove, NY, attorney, Cooper, Williams and Bryan, P.A., 202 NML Building, 123 West Franklin Street, Chapel Hill North. C. 27514, Res. 301 Oak Avenue, Carrara, NC 27510, Pres. Fnans of Old Carrara, MPR, University Ministry Committee, Chapel of the Cross, RN. May 24, 75, Carol Amanda Kaiser, 5. William Taylor, D. Amanda Kaiser. Bryan, 1955, L. Thomas, Jr., LLB. Finance, born July 27, 1933. Palmerton, Pa., 1st VP. First National Bank of Boston, 100 Federal Street, Boston, Mass. 02110, Res. 180 W. Brooklyn Street, Boston, Mass. 02118, 1955 Class Counsel. 75, Associates, Shearman 5, Sterling, 61'66, Est. VP, First National Bank of Chicago, 66'70, Advisory B.D. and Budget Committee, Mass. Bay Transportation Authority, 78,380, LST Lieutenant, AUS, 59'61, M. August 11, 56, Janet E. Henlon, 5. Andrew Thomas, D. Carrollton Elizabeth, Amy Eleanor. Buck, 1969, Charles Henry III, M.A., Ph.D., Business, born March 7, 1946, Boston, Mass., Business de, Research and Administration, 1990 Newtons. California Boulevard, Walnut Creek, California 94596, Res. 2909 Shasta Road, Berkeley, California 94708, in December 21. 70. Cheryl Lynn Esl, d. Jennifer Allison, Sarah Catherine. Buckley, 1975. Christopher Taylor, writing, BAM September 28, 1952, New York City, author, editor, journalist. 608 23 D Street, NW, Washington, D.C. 20037, Res. Same as above, Chief Speechwriter to the VP of the United States, 8183, Roving Editor, Esquire Magazine, Managing Editor, Esquire Magazine. Buckley, 1952, Fergus Reid, writing, BAM July 14, 1930, Paris, France, novelist and lecturer, Bus. Sleeputty Fund, Poe. Box 874, Camden. SC 29020, Res. Cottage No. 1, 22, Bonesman Bush Skull and Bones Yale University. The Bush family is on pages 25 and 26. See page 17, 19, Kamskatka, Kirkwood Lane, Camden, 5.0 29020, LST Lutl, USAA, 52, 54, RN. 1951 Elizabeth Howell, M. 1972, Rosario Tassalegina, 5. William Hunting, X74, Fergus Reid, Jr., Claude Langford, John Alois, 1. Elizabeth Hannah, SS. Francisco de Boer Leguma, Santiago Leguma, Francisco J. Viva Leguma, Francisco de Paula Legina, SD, Patricia Legina. Buckley, 1944, James Lane, LL.B., Led, Government, born March 9, 1923, New York, NY, Press, Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty, Incorporated, Ettingstrasse 67 AM in Glissengarten, 8000 Munich 22, West Germany, Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, February, S.I. Sept. 82, U.S. Senator from New York, 71, 77, Associates, Wiggin and Dana, New Haven, 49'53, VP, The Catawba.com, New York City, 53'70, Lieutenant J. G. UTS.N1, 4346, RN. May 22, 53, Anne Frances Cooley, 5. Peter P., James F. W., William F. 111, David L., Andrew T., D. Priscilla L. Buckley, 1950, William Frank, LHD, LL.D, Lit.D, D.SC.O. Literary World, BAM November 24, 1925, New York, NY, Pressed, National Review Incorporated, 150 East, 35th Street, New York, NY. 10016, Res. 73 East 73rd Street, New York, NY. 10021, Est. Instri Spanish, Yale, 47'51, Associates Editor, American Mercury, 52, Editor 1 and Clue F, National Review, 55, Syndicated Columnist, 63, Host TV Show, Firing Line, 66, CHMN. Of BD, Star Broadcasting Group, Incorporated, author of several books, apt. By Pres. Nixon to 5-member, User Advisory Com, 69, apt. By the President Public Member of the U.S. Delegation to 28th General Assembly of United Nations, host of PBS Great Performances, Bridgehead Revisited, 2D Lieutenant, A.UTS. 1NF, 44'46, M. July 6, 50, Patricia Taylor, 5. Christopher Taylor, 76. Bullock, 1981, Stanton B. Government Service, BAM October 2, 1957, New York, NY, East Hampton Town Councilman, P. Toy Box 1861, East Hampton, NY 11937, elected in November 1982, Bundy, 1921, Frederick McGeorge, MBA Finance Ref, BAM January 4, 1900, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Res. 102 Bnjessel. Manchester, Mass. 01944, Fromest. Treasurer to CHMN. Of B.D., Gortons of Gloucester, Mass. 23'68, Pres. To CHMN. Of B.D., Cape Ann Bank and Trust Co., Gloucester, Mass. President Yale Club of Boston, 44'46, Alumni BD. 56, 59, AIR 1982 Pres. NACL. Fisheries Institute, 53'54, Gloucester Chamber. Of Com., 40'44, Addison Gilbert Hosp, 50'52, Manchester, Mass. Howsam BD, 64'75, 2D. Loti, at U is .F1A, 18, M. September 2, 1981. Elizabeth Jackson Shrigley, S. Frederick McGeorge, JRL, 52, Samuel Swift, 56, David Hollister, 69, D. Patty Hollister A. Two Faces of George Bush, the Doonesbury cartoon by Trudeau, March 1986. As explained in this chapter, Vice President George Bush is an initiate of Skull and Bones Club D.L46, the Yale Secret Society and career springboard for establishment elitists. Less well known is that Gary Trudeau, the cartoonist who draws the highly popular Doonesbury, is also an initiate of Skull and Bones, reported in Success May 1987. Consequently, it is unlikely that Trudeau would cartoon fraternity fellow Bush in a bad light, and this likelihood should be considered as you read the next paragraphs. The last frame of the cartoon is intriguing. The balloons read as follows: "Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Shall we set up the hoops now?" "I love this part," says the gentleman on the right with a smile on his face. What meaning does Trudeau intend to convey with "set up the hoops now"? It's elusive. Basketball fans would say that the political group is about to get some basketball practice or game underway. But can one put a basketball practice or game in a new right meeting addressed by the Vice President of the United States? The Vice President has been a sports enthusiast, but this is not widely known and is not included in official biographies. So, intrigued, we made some inquiries about double meanings for the phrase "set up the hoops now," and came up with a shattering alternate explanation. In contemporary drug slang, to set up the hoops is a code phrase used when users want to get together to fix without others in the room being made aware of their intent. In this slang, to set up the hoops means to fix, that is, to set up cookers, syringes, etc., for use of heroin or cocaine intravenously. You, the reader, will have to choose among the following alternate explanations. L. Trudeau was unaware of the slang use of "to set up the hoops." 2. Trudeau intends to convey the idea that a new right group and the Vice President would get into basketball practice after a Bush political confession. This is certainly not humorous and is far-fetched. 3. Trudeau knew the slang use of "set up the hoops" when he drew the cartoon and used it knowingly when he made the drawings. This interpretation has shattering implications. 4. Set up the hoops has a hidden meaning for Skull and Bones initiates, and they relish in hidden symbolic statements. L.S. Trudeau tell his fellow initiates in Skull and Bones something? We also note Bush links with drug using and smuggling figures in Chapter 11. These links include Conan David Owen c. page 80 and Jim and Tammy Backer c. page 58. In brief, we have other curious links of Bush to cocaine-using circles. Washington Post, May 13, 1987. Chapter 4. Bush, the oil man. George Bush started his business career in Texas Oil, as a salesman for Dresser Industries of Dallas, Texas. We will come back to Dresser later in this chapter. After leaving the U.8 Navy, Bush was 2 years with Dresser. Prescott Bush was a director of this oil supply company which has long-standing links with the Soviet Union. The Bush family then set up George Bush in his own oil and gas lease business as president of Bush Overby Development Company based in Midland, Texas from 19,511,953. Bush then became co-founder and director of Zapata Petroleum Corporation of Midland, Texas, incorporated in Delaware in 1953 and merged with Walker Bush Corporation in 1955. In 1954, Zapata Offshore Company of Houston, Texas was formed with Bush as co-founder and president from 1954 to I-964 and then chairman of the board from 1964 until 1966 when Bush became Republican congressman from the Texas 7th District. In brief, Bush's money came from Texas oil. In this he was always associated with an H.I. Liedtke. Liedtke was, for example, president of Zapata when George Bush was vice president, and Bush then gave Liedtke favored treatment when Bush entered the political scene. We cannot trace why the name Zapata was chosen. It should make an interesting story. Why would an alleged conservative Republican be vice president of an oil company named after Emiliano Zapata, revolutionary, guerrilla fighter, killer and allied with Pancho Villa? The revolutionary forces, the Zapatistas, spent a decade fighting the Mexican, constitutionalist forces under Alvaro Obregón, and this is the name chosen by Vice President Bush for an oil company. Zapata developed a constructive relationship between Bush and Liedtke. In 1977, for example, Bush and Liedtke went, 26 Two Faces of George Bush, to China, Bush in an official capacity. Knowing this, the Chinese made their confidential oil surveys available to Liedtke, the only oil company to receive those surveys. This gesture was obviously because of Bush's official position. More recently, Pennzoil, a Liedtke company, has been the recipient of the largest damages award in American history. Texaco was charged with interfering with a merger deal made by Pennzoil and Getty. For this, the judge awarded a phenomenal $12 billion damages, a sum that if paid could break Texaco. Oddly, no one has investigated possible Bush influence on the outcome of the subsequent appeal, which was settled at $4 billion. 1 year later, another company, Zapata Offshore Company, was founded with George Bush as president and 1H. Liedtke as treasurer. This has become a highly successful operator in offshore drilling for oil. More recently, Bush's son has been president of Zapata Offshore. Bush favors high oil prices. This explains why the vice president personally flew to the Middle East in early 1986 to persuade the Arab countries to raise the price of oil, which had, to the delight of the average citizen, fallen once again below $1 a gallon. Bush used the argument to the Arabs that U.S. security depended on a rise in the price of crude oil, then $12 a barrel on the spot market. With operating costs at $2 a barrel, Arabs were making $8 to $10 a barrel, but this was not enough for the vice president and his Texas oil friends. This Middle East Bush visit triggered consternation in the White House. Here was the vice president of an administration devoted to free markets encouraging use of oligopolistic practices to raise the price of crude. Said one White House official with reference to Bush, "I don't know what he's up to." Wall Street Journal, April 8, 1986. The Reagan administration hastened to put some distance between itself and a vice president who apparently only got tough when crude oil prices started to fall to the advantage of the American consumer. Bush, the oil man, New York Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, New York Small Imam Securities, Miami PM. M. Siklian Miamian, Nun, 0 N. Nampfel 29. NS, Meawi Alsland, ZLWWM shares of Miampmksvman Street 25, par value the. Eagles Plutmal Alu 0101, Ampmnesman. Met HCLDM Nunalblumus Arm, Company. S3154.1711L6. MNN Me Closing PNC, MNIO. Mdladmk on December 7 was RM Me Campaign Zaman Slack. Him, or 3, number of shares of common sum Milomites the company's SZ prefer MKSLMLI. Memble on Mendale. Me Red Complon Value, Ufflegummy, $6 Brefm Slack Lumen L Mu Waded in Ayulay and Hex Humirigmam LLB, filed L repons required be filed by SN 13 or me Senrams exchange OCLI 934 DNRMLM. Procedi L1M and LHSO. M mention a period mu miracleslin linslek M1 no me such muons. Ma 1 has been snjklin my. Filing ye qui emams or me PLSX 90 Fay, _ 7. Documents in Corping H, Rerearance. Pumanx of me Zapm Corp Vion in Yuli Paulem Sakin holders for me fiscal year ended September 3 vertical bar I 985 Alton X left Trent NPMS 14 NDW hereof. Bush the oil man 29 said another official. Look, the policy is and remains free market. That's the core of the policy. The reason there's no oil import fee is because the decisive vote against it was cast by Ronald Reagan. There were even expressions that in hastening to the aid of the high oil price Arabs, Bush may be digging himself a political hole for the 1988 elections. This prompted some Bush double talk. I'm in a listening mode when it comes to the intentions of these major producing countries. And again, the interest in the United States is bound to be cheap energy if we possibly can. But from our interest there is some point where the national security interests of the United States say, hey, we must have a strong viable domestic industry. This is political double talk at its worst. When we needed the Saudis in 1987 during the Iraqi attack on Iraq, they refused to aid us. And it was Dresser Industries, founded with friends of the Bush family, that has been the major assist in expanding Soviet crude oil production, to compete with U.S. and Arab crude. Interesting that the only time one finds non-wimpish behavior on the part of Bush is when oil interests and family business interests are at stake. Crude oil prices promptly rose $2 a barrel right after the Bush Mideast visit. This resolute action on behalf of big oil accounts for the proliferation of oil company contributors to the Bush Political Action Committee PAC Fund for America's Lucha. Probably 1/3 the contributions come from Midland, Dallas and Houston, Texas. Chapter 5 Fast Track Bush privilege is well known to have its advantages, and in the ease of George Bush, born into a privileged elitist Eastern establishment family. The advantages have been numerous. A fairly brief business career built around Texas oil was financed by the Bush family. Zapata had the advantages of Bush investment banking connections and family wealth. Built from scratch starting in 1953, Zapata's 1985 annual report listed revenues of well over $250 million from a fleet of offshore drilling rigs. This relatively unknown company today employs some 7,300 people, not bad for a 30-year-old company built from an idea. However, Zapata owes its success more to an ability to negotiate contracts with large international 011 companies in competition with some 140 other offshore drilling companies. Zapata has been more than willing to take advantage of government financing programs, and especially U.S. government-guaranteed ship financing securities at the favorable interest rate of 855% subsidized by the U.S. taxpayer. The Bush fast track in business can be traced to family connections combined with judicious use of government financing and assistance, rather than good old American free enterprise. It is, however, in the political field that the real fast track elitist favored son George Bush shows up. George Bush has had a remarkable political career. Bush apparently tackles a political objective, falls flat on his face, and is then guided by his elitist friends into a more coveted position by political appointment. In 1963, Bush got elected chairman of the Republican Party in Harris County, Texas, and was a Texas delegate to the 1964 Republican National Convention. Under a cloak of 32, Two Faces of George Bush, cartoon courtesy Unhustle Press Sind. And the Buffalo News, 1987. Goldwater conservatism, Bush campaigned for the U.S. Senate in Texas against the liberal Democratic incumbent Ralph Yarborough. Beating off conservative primary candidates, Bush grabbed the Republican nomination, only to lose to Yarborough by 300,000 votes. But his father, Prescott Bush, United States Senator, was determined that his son George should have a political career. The following exchange was recorded in Texas Monthly Magazine by Harry Hurt 111 between Prescott Bush and Houston Republican James Bertrand. The Bertrand family is skull and bones. Prescott: Jimmy, when are you going to get George involved? Bertrand: Senator, I'm trying. We're all trying. Bush made 2 unsuccessful stabs at the Senate, losing. Fast track: Bush, 33, both times. Running as a Goldwater Republican, Bush actually held left, liberal political opinions, opposing, for example, repeal of the federal income tax, for gun control and a dove on Vietnam. A public facade of conservatism can be traced throughout the Bush political career but is inconsistent with voting records and political actions. Bush basically is a compromiser, reasonableness as he terms it, generating a wimp image. In 1966, with backing from family, friends and the establishment business community, George was elected to Congress from a safe, affluent Houston district. From that point on, Bush adopted what has become known as the Eastern Establishment position, a weak, unprincipled mismatch of policies that has brought now in war and economic chaos to once prosperous, proud United States. As a freshman congressman on the fast track with elitist hacking, Bush was given an unusual honor, an immediate scat on the House Ways and Means Committee. It was reported, Washington Post magazine, September 28, 1986, that Bush got this coveted seat through pressure from Democrat Wilbur Mills, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and then leader of the House Jerry Ford, a Republican. This fast-track treatment honor went to Bush's head. Ambition was all too easily fulfilled and Bush immediately set his eye on the Senate for the second time, where a prudent man would have made a name for himself in the House and then, after multiple terms and a hard-earned political record, moved to the senior chamber. Bush, the eager beaver, waited only 2 terms and ran again for the Senate in 1970, to lose and throw away the opportunities and status brought by family and business contacts. Once again privilege came to George's assistance. To throw up a safe congressional seat on a premature wild gamble for the Senate demonstrates a lack of judgment. This lack of judgment was rewarded by the establishment with a coveted appointment. In February 1971, Bush became U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. His activities in this post we will come back to later. 34. Two Faces of George Bush. In January 1973, this unsuccessful artificial political career was boosted once again, this time by appointment as chairman of the Republican National Committee. The Republicans, in a death wish which allowed the Democrats to promote Jimmy Carter instead of choosing a seasoned, proven hard-nosed politician, chose a 2-time Senate loser who needed outside influence to make his way in Congress, and a loser who was deeply suspect by constitutionalists within the Republican Party. After 18 months at the National Committee, George once again ached for change and without leaving any memorial at the Republican National Committee was appointed by his friends as envoy to the People's Republic of China, to replace an ailing David Bruce. This came about because of the Nixon-Kissinger change of face, that is, to treat Communist China as an ally rather than a threat to a constitutional United States. However, as more than one commentator has observed, principle is not a George Bush hallmark. His approach has been called guiltless pragmatism. In other words, a shifting of course effortlessly from position to position irrespective of principled consistency. The Bush voting record as congressman opposed increasing national debt limit under Democratic President Lyndon Johnson but voted to increase the limit under Republican President Richard Nixon. Consistently voted for foreign aid giveaway programs, including those programs that supported and kept in power various Marxist regimes around the world. Voted for the Family Assistance Act. Voted to remove the gold cover from U.S. currency. Voted for the 1968 Gun Control Act, and then had the nerve to tell a 1980 audience that he opposed gun control. Bush voted for the 1968 Housing and Urban Development Act. Bush voted for the extension of the National Science Foundation into social research, far from its original objectives. Bush supports the Federal Office of Education. Fast Track Bush, 35. In the Bush-China policy we find the Bush pragmatism at work. Actually, pragmatism is no policy, a shifting change of ideas and approaches determined by temporary advantage. Time February 22, 1982, page 22 reported Bush pragmatism as, his conduct suggests that he has expedient political positions, not deeply held convictions. Time can hardly be accused of being anti-Bush. After Till. The journal itself was founded by a dozen members of Skull and Bones, the Bush family fraternity at Yale. The Bush-China policy reflects a pragmatic oneness, which incidentally, over the long run comes across as a wimp approach to the world. In 1964, while running for Congress, Bush was against admitting Red China to the United Nations. As reported in American Opinion September 1982, page 100, Bush stated, "If Red China is admitted to the United Nations, then the UN is hopeless and we should withdraw." But as ambassador to the UN in 1971, Bush worked for admission of Communist China and again was reported, "My own view is that it's in our national interests to have warmest relations with China as soon as possible. China should never be slighted in our foreign policy." Utterly inconsistent with the 1964 anti-China statement. And the Bush reason for the change in position? We should be on China's side. The threat to the free world today does not come from China but from an aggressive Soviet Union. New York Times, March 24, 1980. Yet as we shall see later, the Bush family and associates, in such firms as Dresser Industries, has been a prime supporter of building the Soviet oil industry, the Soviets' largest supplier of foreign exchange and a means of financing world imperialism and terrorism. Communist China did not apparently agree with Bush. He remained only a year as China envoy and then received another coveted boost, this time to director of the Central Intelligence Agency, one of the most sensitive positions in the United States. Nothing in the previous Bush career suggests intelligence orientation. In fact, as Conservative Digest January, 1984 reported, he's foggy on some of the most basic principles. 36. Two Faces of George Bush. Bush had never administered a large government department, had never been involved in intelligence gathering or operations, have no military operations expertise that is staff work, and had never demonstrated the specialist knowledge required for intelligence. Yet from January 1976 to January 1977, Bush was director of the CIA. It is from this period that we can trace the deterioration of CIA activities. Some of the better CIA old-time operators were fired or eased out, as we found to our cost later in the 1980s. CIA was also too much for George Bush. His one-year stint, which looking back was probably instigated to have his personal biography look good, was over in 1977 and he resigned to become a member of the executive committee of First International Bankshares Incorporated, the largest of the Texas bank holding companies. In 1980, to the dismay of conservatives, Bush was selected to run with Ronald Reagan for the presidency and vice presidency of the United States. On the Reagan ticket, Bush made it within a heartbeat of the presidency itself. In brief, nothing in the Bush business or political careers suggests that Bush has any significant ability. He has an ability to fall flat on his face and then with elitist help work out a year in a coveted appointed position. That's about the sum of it. Chapter 6, Bush, internationalist anti-American. As Vice President of the United States and earlier as Director of the Central Intelligence Agency and United States Representative to United Nations, George Bush has taken an oath of allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. In fact, looking back over the Bush career, the oath of allegiance must have been taken on many occasions from induction into the U.S. Naval Reserve onwards. Now, elementary logic suggests that one cannot have a dual loyalty. If the oath of allegiance is taken to the United States and its Constitution, then no other conflicting oath or statement can be made or supported. Yet George Bush is on record also as a supporter of a globalist design known as mondialization, presumably taken from the Latin word mundus, world. Mondialization, Popular during the 1970s is a process by which a town or city unilaterally abdicates from the laws of its own country and declares itself a world city. To quote the promoters of mondialization, the city becomes a fragment of world territory linked to the community of men. A number of communities in countries as far apart as Germany, Denmark, Belgium, Italy, India and Britain have made such unilateral declarations, thus divorcing themselves from the mother country to become part of a mythical world community. For example, on February 20, 1967, Dundas, Ontario, Canada declared itself mondialized, and the city adopted the following steps to demonstrate rejection of Canadian sovereignty: A. To fly the United Nations flag beside the Canadian maple leaf, and B. Raise annually an amount equal to 0.01% of city taxes to be donated to the United Nations, which already has a surplus of high-priced useless tax-exempt bureaucrats. 38. Two Faces of George Bush. Adoption of mondialization is also rejection of national sovereignty. No city or community has the power to do this without due constitutional process. No more can any individual declare himself above the law and opt out of a constitutional process. That is what the whole process of orderly government is about. Mondialization is no more than polite subversion. The first American city to join the New World Order by the mondialization process was Richfield, Ohio. At a dedication ceremony November 22, 1970, city officials abandoned their oath of office and raised the United Nations flag alongside the U.S. flag. At the time, Richfield adopted mondialization. George Bush was the U.S. representative to the United Nations. To abide by his oath of office, George Bush should have scorned the improper legal procedures in its relations with the United States. To the contrary, Bush sent the following message of congratulation to the city, thus encouraging an unconstitutional act and simultaneously breaking his own oath of office. Permit me to congratulate you and the other members of your community on your proclamation of mondialization. There cannot be anything more encouraging to us here than to hear from a community like yours that supports the United Nations and believes in it and in its importance to the establishment of world peace. Equally significant is your community's commitment to help increase understanding among the peoples of the world, for without that understanding peace among peoples can never be achieved. What a profound contribution Richfield is making to man's greatest efforts to build a world in which all the pledges of the UN Charter will truly govern relations among nations. This naive support of subversion of the constitutional process was recorded in the Richfield Community News and Calendar May 1970 as follows: Richfield's actions have been especially commended by the Honorable George Bush, United States Ambassador to the United Nations, by Senator Stephen Young and by Congressman Charles Mosher. The enthusiastic support of George Bush was also recorded in the local Mondialization News in an article by John P. Myers. We made all the big news services and had coverage. Bush, internationalist anti-American, 39. Mondialization symbol chosen by Richfield community, are both Cleveland and Akron. We received congratulations from many, including Youth Ant, Senator Stephen Young, United States Representative to the UN, George Bush, and Representative to Congress, Charles Mosher. A symbol was Hosen. An official committee formed and we were on our way. Lust of and by itself, this Bush action tells us that he is unfit to be President of the United States. It takes no great thought to understand that mondialization is utterly inconsistent with the Constitution of the United States. No government official can support, condone or approve in any way a surrender of U.S. sovereignty. At that time Bush was an officer of the United States government. Bush clearly broke his oath of office. If a world community comes, it has to come only by the constitutional process, not by federal officials who jump every time some dreamer promotes a self-serving device to erode national sovereignty. This support for mondialization was echoed in Bush membership in the Trilateral Commission, a private powerful organization founded and controlled by David Rockefeller, former chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank. The Trilateral Commission had 200 or so members worldwide selected by David Rockefeller and had an extraordinary influence in government. We reported in the former Trilateral Observer that the Trilateral game plan to win the 1980 presidential election surfaced in the Iowa caucus. An article in the Des Moines Register January 28, 1980, Bush, the Trilateralist, Mondialist and One Worldry, by Professor of Politics, Nicholas Zero. Berry, opened as follows: Jimmy Carter's strategy for defeating Edward Kennedy has had the unintentional effect of wrecking Ronald Reagan, boosting George Bush, and raising issues that promote a Republican victory in 1980. Berry goes on to outline the foreign policy errors of Carter and how traditionally such errors had opened the gate to a Republican victory. Berry concluded that Carter has practically ensured his own defeat, and adds, when the bubble bursts, there will be George Bush, the foreign policy expert. So, the Trilateralists would have won either way. Their first shot was incumbent Trilateralist Jimmy Carter, on a Democratic ticket. B. Then second shot is George Bush, foreign policy expert, and a Trilateralist, on a Republican ticket. Bush became vice president on Ronald Reagan's coattails. Many have questions about his former association with the Trilateral Commission. Many in fact, that he issued this, Bush, internationalist anti-American, 41, statement: I personally severed my association with the Trilateral Commission as well as with many other groups I had been involved with because I didn't have time to attend endless conferences. I hold our nation's highest decoration for national security. Clearly I would never have belonged to any organization that had devious designs or favored one world government. We documented that the Trilateral Commission favors a one world economic and political system. We have analyzed the writings of official commission reports and those of its co-founder and original executive directors Binu Brzezinski. Trilaterals over Washington, the August Corporation, 1979. So, with regard to the last sentence of the statement, either Bush was lying to his inquirers, or terribly naive. Whatever Bush may have claimed as reasons for leaving the Trilateral Commission, and expediency appears the most likely, membership in internationalist or New World groups was by no means limited to trilateralism. At one time, Bush was a member of the elitist Powerful Council on Foreign Relations and as a member of the similarly internationalist Atlantic Council made a statement supporting the known admitted goals of the Atlantic Council, that is world government. Said Bush, perhaps the most important fact of all is that the world is now so linked together by investment and trade, that we simply have to try to talk over problems together. Never before in history have people been so aware that this is one world. Vista, reproduced in Spotlight, January 6, 1986. Bush appears to have fallen from the claim that the world is now interdependent and is therefore one world. The point ignored is that the world has always been interdependent. The difference today is that transportation has made distances collapse. It is now easier to get from New York to London or Paris than say Bozeman, Montana. This has given the illusion of interdependence, but in fact the interdependence is not much greater than in previous eras. The claim of interdependence appears to many as the vanguard of imperialism, and imperialism leads to war, not peace. Chapter 7 Bush, the extremist. The real George Bush is decidedly different to the media image of George Bush and certainly from any Bush self-description. Bush hails from the old-line Eastern liberal establishment, cast in the image of Nelson Rockefeller and essentially reflecting a welfare-warfare philosophy. The mark of this elitist group is that it always claims to be centrist and moderate, even when proposing and acting upon the most extreme of proposals. Bush has followed this two-faced gambit. From 1977 until he joined the Reagan, Bush ticket, Bush took a definite stand, in his own wimpish manner, against Reaganite conservative arguments. Repeatedly Bush referred to himself as moderate and tried to unite the Republican Party as a moderate liberal opposed to what he saw as extremist conservative principles. Similarly under Reagan, George Bush has maintained a centrist image while acting as the perfect team player and protected against breaking scandals as he was protected in Watergate. In fact, however, when one looks at actions, and especially foreign speeches and actions, George Bush as vice president comes across as one of the worst of extremists, giving substance to one commentator's phrase that Bush is a chameleon who adopts coloration in order to advance his own interests. This chameleon-like quality is typical of the old-time liberal establishment. We have cited the example of W. A. Harriman Company financing, through Union Banking Corporation, of the early Nazis. We have published the evidence extensively in our Wall Street and the Suite of Hitler. Overall, Harriman was the leader of the Democratic Party and the very essence of welfare warfare state liberalism. However, through the war, Harriman Company, later Brown, Bush, the extremist, 43, brothers Harriman, he was actively, if secretly, linked to the rise of Nazism. Prescott Bush, father of George Bush, was a partner in Brown Brothers Harriman while the Union banking operation link was in place. Now this does not of course implicate George Bush, who was a schoolboy during this period, but it is significant that Bush himself has repeated the two-faced procedure with contemporary regimes that might well be termed fascist of the Hitlerian brand. When Zimbabwe was founded out of southern Rhodesia, Lateral Lord Carrington, a British Foreign Office negotiator, left a British-type constitution and granted certain paper freedoms. Robert Mugabe became Prime Minister and immediately set about suspending the constitution and worked towards rule by decree. Zimbabwe rapidly degenerated into the very worst of human rights violators. The list of violations over the years is horrendously long, but the old-line welfare warfare liberal establishment represented by George Bush has not only refused to face the violations but has enthusiastically lauded and supported Robert Mugabe. In particular, Mugabe has moved against his tribal enemies. Vindalel Matable has been systematically slaughtered by Mugabe in what is locally termed a clean-up campaign. Bishop Muzoewa was imprisoned. Mugabe's cane has been responsible for numerous terrorist acts against blacks and whites, including the murder of 7 Roman Catholic missionaries in 1977. An article in Washington Post February 24, 1986, which can hardly be accused of extremist attitudes, listed the horrible means of persuasion used by Mugabe under the headline "Mugabe promised to crack down on dissent and he meant it." Critics say means of persuasion is torture. Methodist Bishop Abel Muzoewa, head of the United African National Council and the first black Prime Minister of Rhodesia, was imprisoned in Harare Central Police Station by Robert Mugabe without visiting rights and with no formal charges. Muzoewa incurred Mugabe's wrath by charging that oppression in Zimbabwe was worse under Mugabe than under former white rule. Said Muzoewa, "I continue to hope and pray that God can somehow deliver us from the oppression." 44. Two Faces of George Bush, of today, imposed on us not by Ian Smith, not by Israel, and not by people with white skins but by our ruling party and government with black skins. One would expect that moderate George Bush would have lauded Bishop Muzoewa, used the bishop as an example of ruthless persecution of human rights in Africa, and perhaps even come to the bishop's aid. In fact, George Bush took an extremist stance, visited Mugabe and made an extraordinary supporting speech which he presumably did not expect to surface in the Western press. Said Bush about murderer Mugabe, "I stand in the presence of a genuine statesman, the Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe," and added, "I do want to say on behalf of the Reagan administration that we strongly support, the policy of reconciliation to which you have committed yourself. We believe Zimbabwe represents a noble experiment. We have supported your country because its success is consistent with U.S. principles and U.S. interests. I will report to President Reagan that Zimbabwe continues to deserve our support because America is committed to backing peaceful change." This fawning Bush speech was made while Mugabe's political enemies were tortured and forgotten in Harare jails and native villages of the Matable were massacred by Mugabe's guards. This indicates the change of chameleon Bush. That the Bush cry of moderation is merely skin-deep. George Bush's fondness for Hitlerian-like strong men is not limited to Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. When Yuri Andropov was leader of the Soviet Union, Once again Bush demonstrated his fondness for totalitarianism. Here are some Andropov highlights. At only 23, Andropov helped run the slave labor camp building the Moscow-Volga Canal extension. His Gulag experience was rewarded with appointment to the nomenklatura, the party bureaucracy. During the Great Purges, Andropov followed the Stalin line so closely, not an easy job, that he became first secretary of the Kyrgyz Finnish Republic. For 11 years he operated a Gulag system on the spot. Bush the extremist, 45, after the war Andropov stayed in forced labor and advanced by clinging to Suslov's coat tails. In 1956, during the Hungarian Revolution, Andropov pulled a classic double deception, one that should burn itself into the Bush mind. Andropov advised Hungarian General Bela Kirilly that the Soviets wanted to discuss evacuation of Hungary. While negotiations were in progress, the Soviets sent 4,000 tanks built with Western technological assistance into Budapest and crushed the revolution. After this masterstroke of duplicity, it wasn't hard for Andropov to make head of KGB by the mid-60s and become notorious for introduction of forced labor, use of mind-control drugs and a vast disinformation campaign in the West. And what is Vice President Bush's comment on this Hitlerian tyrant? As is the case of Zimbabwe's Mugabe, our friend George can hardly restrain himself from falling all over tyrant Andropov. This adulation surfaced as Bush returned from the funeral of Leonid Brezhnev, when Bush had the opportunity to visit with Yuri Andropov. Here's the fawning Bush again. My view on Andropov is that some people make this KGB thing sound horrendous. Maybe I speak defensively as a former head of CIA, but leave out the operational side of the KGB, the naughty things they allegedly do. Here's a man who has had access to a tremendous amount of intelligence over the years. From this premise, Bush argued that Andropov would therefore be less likely to newsread the intentions of the United States. This statement tells us a great deal about Bush. His concept of human rights is zero. Bush obviously, like Andropov, sees Gulag residents as non-persons, people not worth considering. This reflects the failing of the elite, that it only respects power and has no concept of rights without power. Bush is willing to excuse the KGB record of global terrorism and domestic suppression. Bush not only sympathizes with Andropov, but in not portraying the human side of the Soviet equation, tells us the kind of man Bush would become in 46. Two Faces of George Bush. Power. Would you want executive order power in the hands of a man who excuses KGB atrocities? Another disturbing aspect of the Bush-Moscow visit was his attitude to Soviet whining and dining. Here's Bush again: they treated us very well and, in a protocol sense, outstandingly. They extended us courtesies far above the rank of vice president. We were halfway up the steps and the Soviet protocol fellow came and pulled us out, Secretary of State Schultz and me, and put us ahead of all these chiefs of state, royal highnesses, and excellencies, and plenipotentiaries, and shoved us right up to the head of the line. It was under TV and they could see Schultz and me walking past everybody, and we spent a total of 40 minutes with Andropov, which was a lot of time. This single gee whiz statement is enough to warn any American voting citizen away from a Bush for president ticket. It tells us a great deal about Bush, that he can be flattered and is responsive to these protocol tricks, that he is so insensitive as to be unaware that the Soviets do nothing by accident, that he should be wary not optimistic. Any man that can be influenced by cheap favors one's not fit to be President of the United States. Whatever else we write in this book, this single Moscow statement tells us enough about Bush to rule him out completely from the presidency. Anyone who reacts in this manner has no inner strength. Cheap adulation is accepted because it fills the void left by an absence of inner strength. Bush is a wimp according to his own words. Unfortunately, the Soviets have already characterized Bush as a wimp and know exactly how to play the wimp strings like a violin. The full interview with Yuri Andropov is reproduced on pages 48 and 49 as originally reported in the Christian Science Monitor, December 20, 1982. Just 1 year later, in the fall of 1983, in a tour of Eastern Europe, Bush once again went completely ape in the midst of East European strongmen, without regard for human liberty or history. In Yugoslavia, Bush called the country completely independent and truly non-aligned. Yet Yugoslavia is a Bush, the extremist, 47, known transshipment point for illegal high-tech exports from the West destined for the Soviet Union. In the United Nations, Yugoslavia has supported the United States only 21.8% of the time, while the Soviets did 17.7% of the time. This hardly makes Yugoslavia non-aligned. On the same trip in Hungary, Bush toasted János Kadar as a man with enormous capacity and leadership capability and made the unbelievable statement that human rights was no longer a point of discord between the United States and Hungary. A quick response to this Bush statement came from Dr. Andras Pogany, former chairman of the World Federation of Hungarian Freedom Fighters. Pogany called the Bush remarks shocking, disgusting and outrageous, adding that Kadar is a faithful servant of the Soviet masters, a well-known traitor, killer and mass murderer of 18-year-old Hungarian kids, and Bush's comments earn the contempt of our adversaries and the disgust of suffering and oppressed millions behind the Iron Curtain. In Romania, the worst of the East European dictatorships, Bush continued his fawning, groveling obeisance to communist leaders, citing Romania's independence and prosperity. In fact, Romania is not at all prosperous and is a miserable example of communist planning chaos gone wild, with one of the lowest standards of living in any communist country, which themselves are notorious for an inability to fill the needs of the working class. What does this tell us about Bush? Essentially, Bush is more dangerous than a mere wimp who lacks inner strength. Bush is unread on the realities of the world. The often observed comment that Bush is uncomfortable around common people is true. Bush is a perfect specimen of elitism. Not only is he uncomfortable with the common man, but he ignores the human need for freedom, and we suspect may even despise the peasant in the street. 48. Two Faces of George Bush. George Bush on Yuri Andropov by Godfrey Sperling Jr. Washington Vice President Bush is not predicting a thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations. But, because Soviet leader Yuri Andropov may be especially well informed about the U.S., Mr. Bush believes an improvement of ties may be possible in a 40-minute, year-end monitor interview in his White House office. Mr. Bush had this to say, Q. You've just been to Moscow for Brezhnev's funeral. How do you read the mood there? They've said publicly and they've said to us that they have a desire to have improved relations. They treated us very well and, Emma protocol sense, outstandingly. They accorded us courtesies far above the rank of vice president. My view on Andropov is that some people make this KGB THRNG sound horrendous. Maybe I speak defensively as a former head of the CIA. But leave out the operational side of KGB, the naughty things they allegedly do. Here's a man who has had access to a tremendous amount of intelligence over the years. In my judgment, he would be much less apartment to misread the intentions of the United States. And you know, and I know, the Democrats and the Republicans and the US would just not go out and make war on the Soviet Union. And that 15-something which I think a political boss out of a Vladivostok or a Leningrad might be less apartment to know than a man who ran the intelligence organization. That offers potential. And the other side of that is he's toughy, and he appears to have solidified his leadership position in a very short period of time, although it is too early to say how long that will last. That's their internal affair. And I wouldn't speculate publicly on it. Except to say that it was very clear that he was very much in charge. So there is reason to be hopeful on the basis of this. You've got to be hopeful. Q. The leaders were hospitable then? Oh, yes, every diplomat saw this, but I haven't seen it written. But we were halfway up the steps, and the Soviet protocol fellow came and pulled us out, Schultz and me, and put us ahead of all these chiefs of state, royal highnesses, and excellencies, and plenipotentiaries, and shoved us right up to the head of the line. But it was very noticeable to everybody. It was under TV and they could see Schultz and me walking past everybody. But this was just one manifestation of this hospitality. and we spent a total of 40 minutes with Andropov, which was a lot of time. Q. What is the president's position on nuclear arms? A. This president really wants a reduction in arms. Most people don't know that. Because you've got that freeze THMG out there. And people out there say, if you really want an absolute reduction in arms, you go for the freeze. And those of us who, Bush, the extremist, stand for the freeze are automatically categorized as not for a reduction in arms. It's an argument one take great offense with, incidentally. I find it intellectually offensive to suggest that, given the history of the ABM Treaty and everything else. So there is this whole kind of feeling out there. And those of us who know the president's position so well probably haven't been as articulate as we might have been in trying to make people understand that this president is absolutely convinced that we must achieve a reduction. A real demonstrable, visible, verifiable reduction in nuclear weapons. Q. Why isn't this perceived? A. Well, if it weren't accompanied with the president's requirement that there be a strengthening of the United States defense, it would be. 49. Washington letter. But it's the last caveat that causes people to say that it's a ruse. He doesn't really feel that way. I don't question people's integrity in this. They just don't know how strongly the president feels about all this. And one do. One see Hun, talk to him, with people and alone. Q. Does Andropov's own organization dabble in the gathering of accurate information that would enable him to have accurate knowledge about the Soviet weaknesses? A. All I would guess, based on my understanding of the intelligence apparatus, is that the person who had exposure to that would be more apartment to have the objective data than one who dealt all his life with the propaganda machinery or with the party network. Not that Andropov isn't part of the party. Q. But does he have access to the information necessary to get at the real facts about Russia? La, I think he has access. But given his party standing and what we know of him, I don't want to make the case that he doesn't have convictions that are quite contrary to what we think the objective data should give him. He's no softie, or anything like that. We're still dealing with a totalitarian system, where you don't know what's happening all of the time. Q. Is this administration concerned that tensions between the Chinese and the Soviets may be easing? A. So what if there is a reduction of tensions on the Soviet-Chinese border? I don't think that is necessarily detrimental to the interests of the United States. Now if you say to me that the Soviets are going to take 20 divisions off the Chinese border and put them into Europe, then we would say, hey, that wouldn't be very good, that would be destabilizing. But just to have reductions in tensions between them, I don't think that should make us feel all uptight. Just as if we reduce tensions with China that should drive the Soviets up the wall. Q. Finally, your assessment of this administration and midterm? A. My assessment is this: unemployment is too high. Interest rates are much better. Inflation is much better. Deficits are outrageous. We have to do something in a bipartisan fashion to get those down. But the president turned a lot of things around. The credibility of the U.S. is much better. Godfrey Sperl Jr. is chief of the Monitor's Washington Bureau. Chapter 8: Where Bush Money Comes From. Bush has a public image of Eastern liberal establishment and sure enough that's where Bush money originates, except for healthy chunks from Wall Street and Texas oil. A perennial backer is Trilateral Commission Chairman, international banker, David Rockefeller and the Rockefeller family. In the 1979 elections, Rockefeller family contributions averaged $1,000 per head. In the 19,856 period for Fund for America's Future, the Bush Personal PAC, the Rockefeller family contributed a maximum $5,000 apiece. See listing from the Federal Election Commission, page 51. The Schedule G selected list of receipts and expenditures, individual contributions for the Fund for America's Future is a good place to search for further establishment backing. See pages 54 and 55. Recently PubShet HSTS for $198,586 have the following entries from the Bush family itself: contributions from Dorothy W. Bush $5,000, Frederick M. Bush $1,000, George W. Bush Jr. $500, Jonathan Bush $1,000, Laura W. Bush $500, Mary Zero. Bush $500, Nancy Bush $1,000 and William H. T. Bush $500. This is followed by $1,000 from the bluest of the blue bloods, Louis W. Cabot of Cabot Corporation, contrasted with $5,000 from Stephen J. Conway of Ivan Boesky Corporation. Boesky has of course been charged with numerous counts of insider trader and faces long jail terms if found guilty. Fellow Skull and Bones brother Gaylord Donnelly kicked in $2,500 and another $5,000 came from William Draper 111 at Export-Import Bank. Another influential contributor was Henry Ford 11 of Grosse Pointe Farm, Michigan with the maximum $5,000. Prescott Bush was a partner in the Investment Bankers, where Bush money comes from. 51. Brown Brothers Harriman, which is still supporting Bush with $500 from partner Eldridge T. Gerry and $5,000 from present partner R.L. Ireland and $2,000 from Kate Ireland. Bush's old company's Aparta Petroleum was represented by a contribution of $1,000 from director Ray G. Gaimard. A group of contributions from the Liedtke family is noted in the chapter on Bush and the oil interests. J. Q. Liedtke is chairman of Pennzoil, caught up in a massive dispute with Texaco Corporation, and awarded the largest legal settlement in U.S. history, granted on somewhat tenuous grounds. The Liedtke family kicked in a total of $12,000 in 1985. Oil is heavily represented with $5,000 from T.B. Pickens Jr. Mesa Petroleum and other amounts from dozens of smaller oil and exploration companies located in Midland, Dallas and Houston, Texas. This is a very similar pattern to contributions to Bush in his 1979 presidential campaign, which then came heavily from trilateralist sources. Bush insists that his relationship with the Trilateral Commission or its members has been insignificant and be severed. We only need to look further to find that neither is true. Trilateral Commission members, their aristocrats and families, are heavily involved with Bush. By December 31, 1979, no less than 15 members of the Trilateral Commission had donated substantial sums to the George Bush for President campaign, as reported to the Federal Election Commission. I. David Rockefeller, North American $1,000 chairman of the Trilateral Commission. Former chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank. Other Rockefellers donating to Bush include Edwin S. Rockefeller, Godfrey A. Rockefeller, Helen G. Rockefeller, Lawrence S. Rockefeller, Mary F. Rockefeller, Rodman Rockefeller. In addition, the following associates of Rockefeller operations made contributions: George Champion, Chase Manhattan Bank, Peter Crisp, Rockefeller Family and Associates, where Bush money comes from. 53. Trilaterals are also using influence to gather money for Bush. Brown Brothers Harriman, an establishment Wall Street investment banker. Trilaterist Robert V. Ruser is a partner, has 15 contributors to Bush totaling $9,000. One of the most important positions in any political campaign is the issues director. This person helps draft issues to be discussed and ensures their consistency. Bush appointed Stephen Halper to this vital function. Halper was formerly legislative assistant to Senator William Roth, a trilateral commissioner. Another key campaign post is press secretary. For this position Bush recruited Peter Thiele, who was formerly press secretary for Republican National Committee Chairman Bill Brock, also a trilateral commissioner. Two other Bush appointees who are not directly connected with trilateral commissioners are, nevertheless, interesting. Deputy Press Secretary Susan Morrison left her job with the Democratic National Committee to join Bush, and George Whitgraff, Iowa State Chairman and Director of the January Caucus Victory, was leader of previous Nelson Rockefeller presidential campaigns in that state. Further evidence of continuing trilateral influence is a fundraising letter sent to Kebus Messman in the southern states by the Houston, Texas George Bush for President Committee. One of the signers was trilateral George H. Weyerhaeuser, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Weyerhaeuser Corporation. In early February 1979, The Baltimore Sun carried a Washington syndicated article entitled "Bush Picks Up Two Surprising Endorsements." The article stated in part, James A. Baker, Bush's campaign manager, said here the timing of the two endorsements just happened to coincide. The Elliot Richardson endorsement had been scheduled for some time, and Ruckelshaus, now a vice president of Weyerhaeuser and Company in Federal Way, Washington, had planned to be in Washington Tuesday. So the announcement was made then. These endorsements may have been surprising to that writer, but perhaps he did not know that Richardson and Ruckelshaus are both members of the Trilateral Commission. Two faces of George Bush. Endorsement support for Bush by prominent businessmen and politicians is certainly not unexpected, but the pattern develops. Members of the Trilateral Commission voiced their support at strategic campaign points, to get maximum impact through press coverage. In preparation for the 1988 presidential elections, George Bush established a political action committee PAC known as Fund for America's Future. With 11,000 square feet of office space in downtown Washington, D.C., Fund for America's Future has scores of staffers and is extremely effective in raising money. One reason for this success is a peculiar loophole in the law under which a PAC can receive $5,000 every year from each contributor instead of the usual maximum $1,000 in a presidential campaign fund. This dubious legality, using the PAC high limit for an obviously presidential election campaign, has not gone unnoticed and has been challenged as illegal. It was first challenged by Howard Baker Jr., one-time presidential candidate, but was dropped when Baker was appointed White House Chief of Staff. At this time Bush appears to have won the day and a pile of money with a tactic that skirts around the federal election law in the pre-announcement period. By mid-1987 the Bush PAC had shown extraordinary success, and raised more money than any other of the 4,567 PACs registered with the federal government. In 2 years the Fund for America's Future raised $9.37 million, or more than 3 times the amount raised by Senator Dole. Legislation now before Congress July 1987 proposes to limit the ability to sue PACs to cover pre-announcement presidential campaign expenses, but by the time Congress acts, if ever, an announcement will have been made. Bush for President in 1988. Chapter 9 Smoking Guns. Look for a smoking gun in the George Bush career and you end up frustrated. Leads there are, by the score. But to put together a solid case on a substantial ISN is more difficult. Bush is either the cleanest politician in the 20th century or he has a notoriously good cover-up mechanism. In this chapter we will outline some apparent smoking guns, some can be proven, some we can wash out. In the next chapter we will explore in more depth the international drug trafficking problem where Bush is up to his neck in episodes that need public explanation. The Other Woman rumors. In early summer 1987 a flurry of rumors in Newsweek, U.S., News and World Report were picked up by most newspapers around the United States. The report, in more or less detail, linked Bush to a long-term affair with a personal female political aide. Bush staffers were understandably furious and inclined to point to the Dole campaign in Iowa as the source. In point of fact, denials came from others than Bush himself. Son Christopher Bush made the definitive denial. The answer to the bigger is no. Campaign spokeswoman Barbara Perger indicated that those spreading the rumors should be ashamed of themselves. This hardly stopped the Chicago Tribune from running a gossip column item that Mr. Boring might be engaged in extramarital affairs. In the final analysis not a shred of evidence surfaced. Maybe Bush did indeed have an outside affair. If he did, it was effectively squashed in the media. More plausible are smoking guns that implicate the Bush staff, his aides and associates, stopping just short of Bush, 58. Two faces of George Bush himself. It's as if Bush has the art of plausible deniability down to a fine art. The PTL link of Bush aides' involvement with the notorious PTL Jim and Tammy Bakker case leaves a vague unsavory aura around Bush. Although the basis for rejection of the Bakkers from the PTL church was announced as adultery and homosexuality, there is definite evidence that cocaine use had an unpublicized role. Tammy Backer was reportedly a heavy cocaine user and entered the Betty Ford Center for Treatment of Drug Addiction. There were numerous links from the Bush White House to the PTL run by the Backers, including transfer of significant money to a Bush aide, far more than the supposed services warranted. Doug Reed, an ordained Assemblies of God minister and a friend and frequent guest of the Backers, is today on the Bush campaign payroll as liaison to special groups including especially the evangelical churches. Reed, who has no connection with drug use that we know of, introduced Jim Backer to Peter B. Thiele. Thiele is a long-time close Bush aide and was Bush's press secretary until 1984. Thiele received enormous sums from the Backers. Between October 1985 and April 1986, Thiele received $120,000 for only vaguely specified work. For example, Thiele recommended, as part of his work and about the only work he has publicly claimed, that Dean Birch, another Bush advisor, become its Washington lawyer specifically to represent it before the FCC, with whom the PTL had an unsavory reputation. In fact, it was a squashed FCC probe that was the turning point in PTL affairs and started the Backers on the road to first fortune, then downfall as they milked the PTL ministry. Charges of fraudulent fundraising were dismissed at the FCC, a closed case with obvious political intervention. The Bush camp connection with the PTL ministry has never been investigated. Improper pressure for dam project approval in April 1986. C. Jerry Bishop, president of California Save Smoking Guns, 59, R. Stream's co-uncle, publicly charged the vice president with improper pressure on a federal agency to give approval to a Yosemite area private hydroelectric project. The project was a $5.4 million diversion from Lewis Fork Creek in the Sierra National Forest. The applicant, a Bill Dyer, whose father is William H. Dyer of Fullerton, California. Dyer Sr. is reported as a 40-year-old friend of the Bush family with ties going back to 1950s Texas oil days. Bishop obtained federal records to show that a Bush aide, Barbara Lowe, made at least 2 calls to the U.S. Forest Service to push forward approval of the power project. Iran-Contra ARMS sales. The political scandal of 1987 was the Iran-Contra deal, in which arms sold to Iran generated funds transferred through Swiss bank accounts to the Contra anti-Marxist forces of Nicaragua. Bush has consistently denied that he knew anything about the diversion of funds. While admitting that mistakes were made in selling arms to Iran, the Bush position was that this was the only realistic policy to offer hope for release of hostages held in Lebanon. These denials are not acceptable because Bush was a member of the National Security Council and head of the administration's anti-terrorism unit. In fact, even the Bush office has admitted that he may have been aware of some aspect of this policy. For example, in November 1986, Marlin Fitzwater, the Bush spokesman, declined to state what the vice president knew but agreed that Bush was aware of the total policy of the government. Contrary to these official positions, there are pointers that Bush was in fact deeply involved and aware of operational details as well as approving the policy moves. Highly implicating are tapes made by U.S. Customs Service which ended up in a federal courtroom as Israeli businessman Guriel Eisenberg was accused of conspiring to sell $2 billion of arms to Iran. One tape recording is a conversation between an Edelman, American attorney Samuel Evans, and Cyrus Hashemi, an 62 Faces of George Bush, Iranian businessman, also an undercover agent for the U.S. government. On one tape, Evans tells Hashemi, "The green light now finally has been given. Bush is in favor, Schultz is against, but nonetheless they are linked to proceed." Reported Washington Times, November 28, 1986. Yet another tape between former Army Colonel John DeLaroque and Hashemi has roke as follows: "My understanding is the following. It will move from the vice president through the president. The vice president, and he's his own man at this point. He's for it. Now it's as far as it can go. And the man that has it now says it's good. You know who he is. He used to be the head of the CIA, so he knows what he's doing." Bush of course was CIA director under President Ford. Additionally, there are rumors, surfaced by Jack Anderson's column to the effect that a memorandum written by Bush's national security advisor explicitly admits to knowledge of the arms shipments and transfer of funds to the Contras. The Bush position is entirely inconsistent with the above tapes and memos. In Time December 8, 1986, Bush is quoted as flatly denying any knowledge. Witness his replies to Time. On whether the arms deals were designed as part of a larger scheme to fund the centers. I know nothing about that. And that is absolutely untrue as far as the origin of the president's operation, totally untrue. 0 N allegations that he was involved WLLHL private funding of the centers through contacts with a former CIA agent called Max Gomez. I feel pretty darn strongly about this because I've heard these rumors and I've been a victim of some of them. I've told the truth, and yet I continued to read these stories. So I can speak more viscerally than if I hadn't felt the sting of some of these false charges. There is this insidious suggestion that I was conducting an operation. It's untrue, unfair and totally wrong. I met Max Gomez 3 times and never discussed Nicaragua with him. What I did discuss was what he was doing in terms of the counterinsurgency in El Salvador, something that is of fundamental policy interest to the U.S. There was no linkage to any operation, yet it keeps coming up. There are all kinds of weirdos coming out of the woodwork on this thing. Smoking Guns, 61. The hearings closed abruptly. Scheduled witnesses were never called. The leads involving the White House were never pursued. This smoking gun leads directly to the drug smuggling episodes covered in Chapter 10. These inconclusive, potentially damaging episodes in the Bush career extend into the dozens. Others include the Jack Anderson charge November 3, 1986, that a Louisiana oilman, Dalton Woods, improperly prevailed on Vice President George Bush to press for an end to federal regulations that made possible the prosecution of oil price control violators. Another Jack Anderson charge, Washington Post, May 13, 1987, that a political appointee, Ernest Olivers, drummed up support for Bush using official telephones, a violation of the 1939 Hatch Act. The B.F. Hutton case, where E.F. Hutton pled guilty to over 2,000 counts of check kiting. Hutton, Chairman Pierce, is Bush's brother-in-law. The Texaco Pennzoil case, in which Pennzoil was awarded, after appeal by Texaco, $4 billion. The Pennzoil chief executive officer is J. Q. Liedtke, former partner to George Bush in the Zapata oil days and an old family friend. By another odd quirk, the chief counsel in the Pennzoil case was none other than Arthur Liman, the chief counsel in the Iran-Contra hearings that ended so abruptly. There is a remarkable pattern to Bush smoking guns. They initially appear to be based on sound evidence from credible sources, that is, a memorandum or tape recording. Furthermore, in many instances the charges are substantial, at least improper use of government office, and anyone, if proven, could damage Bush. What happens in every case is that the smoking gun evolves into a damp squib. Everything once dropped. Everyone goes home. Bush emerges as if the charge had not been made in the first place. Either Bush is innocent, or, as we stated at the opening of the chapter, Bush has a remarkably good cover-up mechanism. Just on the mathematical laws of averages, one would expect that so many shouts of fire would produce a fire. Chapter 10, Bush and the Wimp Factor. In early 1986, both front-runners Hart and Bush had public image problems. Hart was known as a womanizer, and that finally sank his candidacy in May 1987, while Bush, even to sympathetic commentators, was undeniably the wimp. The odd point is that Bush does have a credible war record in the Pacific. See page 5. Bush's problem is that he is forever reminding audiences that he is indeed an authentic war hero, and don't forget it, please. As we pointed out earlier, authentic heroes have no need to emphasize heroism. Can you imagine General Douglas MacArthur telling an audience he was a war hero, or Organ's Renji synthetic hair shows to promote personal war hero images? One commentator, Larry Liebert, argued that Bush only compounded the wimp factor by denying it, confirming the problem by conspicuously denying it. Bush insisted the other day that his record of heroism in World War II disproved the notion that he is handicapped by what he called a wimp factor. April 23, 1967. How does one judge a war hero? Presumably Bush is relying on 3 Navy medals because thousands, tens of thousands of other men had similar experiences, falling in the sea to be rescued. Unfortunately, the history of Father Prescott Bush in World War I and his fellow Skull and Bones brothers leads an observer to wonder whether Bush received favored treatment when it came to the boasted medals. If Prescott Bush could become an instant captain in a regiment with the same number 322 as his fraternity chapter, then why could not son Bush be favorably considered when medals were handed out? It is not unknown to allocate so many medals per unit for distribution at the discretion of the commanding officer. Bush and the wimp factor, 63. Then we have the notorious Bush inconsistencies, and inconsistencies from anyone give an appearance of weakness or wimpishness. A week before Randgate broke, Bush told Business Week, "I'm in on everything. If our policies aren't working, I can't say wait a minute, I'm not to blame." After making that statement, Bush would have been well advised to stand by his guns on Irangate. On the contrary, Bush wiggled and claimed reservations. Then he made the extraordinary statement we quote below, a kind of verbal potpourri of evasion. Bush denies knowledge of diversion of Iran funds to the Contras, yet the very first news of the Hasenfus episode, Hasenfus's plane was shot down in Nicaragua on a Contra supply run, went to the office of the Vice President himself. To counter this image, his staff make periodic attempts to appear tough. The 1984 presidential debate comes to mind. Bush publicly accused Geraldine Ferraro and Walter Mondale of charging that U.S. Marines in Lebanon died in shame. This was untrue and Bush knew it was untrue. Yet the next day, Bush sniggered to a group of longshoremen that he had kicked a little ass in the Ferraro debate. Bush was weak enough to wait for the effects of a poll to sink in before he apologized. Bush had lied. Further, Bush had not apologized until after the cheap shot had earned public acclaim. Then, Bush denied he had used the term voodoo economics in reference to Reagan's economic position. Ken Bode, the NBC political correspondent, caught Bush in this lie by digging up the 1980 TV tape in which Bush had clearly used the term voodoo economies with reference to Reagan's position. Another lie. Indecision is easy to find. As Larry Liebert puts it for Republican Bush, his nervous laugh and preppy oh gosh style has combined cloyingly with the puppy loyalty required by his job as vice president. This cloying loyalty is taken too far by Bush, so far that it generates an image of indecision. Witness the Bush explanation of his position on sending 64 Two Faces of George Bush arms to Iran, where Defense Secretary Weinberger and Secretary of State Schultz had taken opposing positions. Bush said, "My position on the advice I give the president is, it's only discussed with him. Sometimes it results in a downer. Sometimes you've got to take a lot of political heat for that. Sometimes it doesn't affect things one way or another. But I'm not going to change that policy. I think the key players around know I expressed certain reservations on certain aspects. I also see some things in the media that I know not to be true. I wish I could help you on that, but I'm not going to because it would undermine the very foundation of the vice presidency." Now, just what is all this supposed to mean? With this meaningless spiel, no wonder Bush has a wimp image. Rather than come out with the above, Bush would have been well advised to keep his mouth shut. It is such verbal loitering all over the lot that produces Bush the wimp. The man doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut. Bush talks for the sake of talking. That, to us, is pure wimp. The Bush campaign has to face a widespread image of Bush the wimp. Bush seems unable to present himself as a strong leader. The presidential aura eludes him. The image of Bush is pure Connecticut Yankee, upper class, Yale, preppy, and as one commentator put it, so strong is his image that Bush may enter the political record books as the only authentic combat hero to be tagged as a wimp. Jeff Greenfield, January 18, 1987. Wimp stories abound. At the famous Gridiron Club dinner held in Washington, D.C., in March 1987, Vice President Bush demonstrated he was no humanist, although it would be hard to compete with that master actor Ronald Reagan. Here's one report on the Bush fiasco. Among the Veep's jokes was his description of himself and his wife Barbara reading the stock market tables at night. Bush said he asked her, "Barbara, was it as good for you as it was for me?" Members of the audience were seen wincing. By all appearances, Mrs. Bush seated on the platform in front of the crowd was not amused either. Bush and the wimp factor, 65. Unlike many, or perhaps most, politicians, Bush is generally agreed to have a strong, stable and supporting family environment. No one ever links Bush to other women, but see page 57. That's a plus. Even the drug connections we allude to elsewhere do not affect Bush personally, including the Doonesbury cartoon on page V23, but refer more to his entourage. Given the prevalence and availability of drugs in modern society, this is a strong tribute to Bush. On the other hand, the seeming purity may even emphasize an unwanted wimp image. The solution hatched by Bush staff aides to offset the wimp picture may contain more dangers than the image itself. Some aides came up with the idea of a defining event, 1.e, to locate an event George and Barbara, fun couple or group of incident that Bush could take on with an artificial fight that Bush would win. Kind of an instant prefabricated hero, in which Bush could show strength and win a battle. There are two criticisms to this strategy. First, it won't work. One can't create personal strength or even the appearance of strength from a single fabricated event. Second, the word is now out that the event will be fabricated, so exposure neutralizes any effect there might be to the idea. Does the United States want a genuine authentic wimp as president? After some past rogue presidents, it might not be such a bad idea. On the other hand, we need a president with strong principles and a firm hand. And these qualities Bush does not have by his own words. 66. Two Faces of George Bush, reproduced from the San Francisco Chronicle Monday, May 25, 1987, Rice on her lap in Inquirer photo Ordnard PR. New York. The National Enquirer has published photographs that show model Donna Rico sitting on the lap of former presidential candidate Gary Hart with his arm around her. In a story accompanying the photos, the tabloid newspaper quoted unidentified friends of Rice who said she confided to them that Hart told her he was smiling. Hart is depicted holding maracas. Broadhurst is seated behind a set of drums and women are holding microphones. In both Little Yours, Hart is shown carrying a shirt that said "Monkey Business True," an apparent reference to the yacht on which the foursome sailed to Bimini in the Bahamas in March. Lahr dropped out of the presidential race May 8 after revelations that Rice spent part of a weekend him at his Washington townhouse. Both denied they romantic involved month each other. Jadaidson, an expert on photographic forgery who was in Ouvrage yesterday on Cable News New York, examined videotapes, saw the photos as they appeared in the June 2 edition or the Inquirer and said he be I5 the Pitux FLRL authentic. It would just be very vertical bar cult to get both persons, one being cut out and the other one being posted over. In order I make it look authentic, Davidson said. The National Enquirer said the photos were taken in Bimini planning to divorce his wife and marry her after Ho was elected president. The Enquirer refused to say where it obtained the pictures, which it said were taken in Bimini, or how much it paid, or them. We contacted the people who had the pictures, said Enquirer editor Ian Calder. We negotiated with them, and we got the pictures. We certainly be authentic. Another photo shows Hart and Rice standing with William A. Broadhurst, a friend of Hart's, and Lynn Arment, a friend of Kicks You Own New Broadhurst. A. asked for reaction to the Electura star. Hart's former assistant campaign manager, Mike Stratton, said my comment is not printable. Thomas McCorlick, the Miami lawyer who represents Rico, said he knows nothing about the Inquirer's story or photographs. Chapter 11 Bush - Drug Overlord. The real smoking gun in the Bush camp may not be wimpishness, nepotism, conflict of interest, infidelity or any one of a dozen other accusations made by the Bush bashers. When it comes down to hard facts, the evidence for these smoking guns may be barely conclusive but not overwhelming even to the dedicated Bush basher. By contrast, the smoking gun with real potential is also one where barely a whisper of evidence has surfaced in the U.S. establishment media. We find curious pointers to Bush involvement in drug traffic, that is, to that deliberate, pervasive sickness that is destroying American society. We agree from the outset that part of the picture we present below could be explained on the basis of gross inefficiency, ignorance or stupidity. On the other hand, the picture we portray could also suggest massive betrayal and subversion of our values, much as George Bush's father, Prescott Sheldon Bush, was associated with W. A. Harriman Company and banking finance of the early days of Adolf Hitler. We have reproduced a Doonesbury cartoon pp 22 and 23 more as a curiosity than as evidence. A cartoon is not evidence. It is barely a lead. We do not believe the VP is a user as might be implied by the cartoon. However, the evidence available suggests the possibility of something even more deadly and more vicious than mere use, the promotion by neglect or design of a global drug distribution network. We have four distinct sets of facts to consider: that Vice President George Bush is the highest U.S. government official in the war against drugs, that is, Bush is chairman of President Reagan's cabinet-level working group, 72 Faces of George Bush, and director of the National Narcotics Board Interdiction System. B. The testimony of Colonel James Bo Gritz, USA Ret, which implicates highest U.S. government officials in Golden Triangle heroin exports. C. Bush links to contra-drug money through a separate evidence chain, but with the same argument presented by Colonel Gritz. D. The CIA operative links to international drug traffic reported by CBS in great part stem from the days when George Bush was director of the CIA. Let's look at these four facets of possible Bush involvement in drug traffic. A. Bush as the anti-drug fighter. Back in early 1982, Vice President Bush announced a wide-ranging program of drug interdiction. It was announced by Bush that U.S. Navy destroyers would carry Coast Guard teams to board suspicious drug smuggling boats off Florida. The Customs Service would receive 3 Cobra gunships, making a fleet of 4 gunships altogether, looking for drug smugglers' planes at deserted airstrips. Tougher rules were issued by the Federal Aviation Administration applying to all aircraft entering Florida, with a requirement to land on designated airstrips. An additional 45 agents were added to the already 100-man force of customs and drug enforcement agencies already operating in Florida. Homestead Air Force Base was to be used as a base for 2 Navy Hawkeye E-2C radar planes. Impressive. Following these moves, some spectacular busts in southern Florida were shown to the media, with Vice President Bush photographed surveying the operations. All this anti-drug activity in practice was a public relations show. It was worse than useless. By mid-1985 even the Reagan administration had noted a complete Bush failure in drug interception, not just inefficiency but something akin to fraud and deliberate note. Cassette tape of an interview with Colonel Bo Gritz is obtainable from PO. Box 882134, San Francisco, California 94188 at $15 postpaid. Make checks payable to A.C. Sutton. Bush, drug overlord. 71. Sabotage of effective anti-drug enforcement administration. These are not merely the author's conclusions. This failure is reflected in a General Accounting Office report in July 1985 which, while unpublished because of its explosive contents, was leaked. The leak described Bush drug interdiction efforts officially as ineffective. There were no benefits from the National Narcotics Border Interdiction System, directed by George Bush. In fact, the overall effect was to encourage drug supply because each agency, that is, Customs, Coast Guard and Drug Enforcement Administration, gave up part of its budget to the interdiction system, thus reducing their overall effectiveness in the field. In 1984, Francis M. Mullen Jr., then head of Drug Enforcement Administration and an effective administrator of his own agency, called George Bush's program an intellectual fraud and a liability rather than an asset. Mullen resigned and the subsequent Gao report was squashed. Note the words fraud and liability. During the early 80s, heroin and cocaine imports into the United States increased by leaps and bounds. The Bush program had not only failed to stop imports but drained resources away from interdiction. In 1972, for example, the flow of heroin into the U.S. was about 60 tons. After the Bush program in 1986, it was 600 tons, that is, 10 times greater. It is projected as 900 tons for 1987. Why? Because under Bush, the anti-drug overlord, the Thai government, with U.S. government assistance, built a 2-lane paved highway right into the heroin-producing Golden Triangle. Heroin can now be transported by 10-ton trucks rather than by horse and mule. This is the Bush anti-drug interdiction program at work. Be the testimony 0F Colonel Bo Gritz, benign neglect or gross inefficiency is not evidence of wrongdoing. That heroin imports increased by leaps and bounds under the Bush interdiction program does not prove Bush guilty of drug trafficking. It does, however, raise our interest in the nature of Bush objectives. At this point we find some extraordinary evidence that 72 Two Faces of George Bush. At one point in the 1970s, the Drug Enforcement Administration was apparently working hand in hand in the same office with the Nguyen Hand Bank at Chiang Mai in Thailand. This bank was known as part of an international heroin smuggling ring operated by Frank Nguyen and Michael Hand. Further, U.S. Army Colonel Bo Gntz, who started work to find missing in action veterans, ended up by uncovering, with the aid of Ross Perot, the Texas Electronics philanthropist, a story which linked drug smuggling at Chiang Mai to the highest levels of the U.S. and other governments. In brief, when we look below the surface, we find that while the Bush program could have interdicted heroin supplies at Chiang Mai, in fact, the program built a 2-lane highway to expedite heroin shipments, and instead of a task force to block off the route, we find a bank to facilitate drug transactions. Lieutenant Colonel James Bo Gritz testified to the House Foreign Affairs Committee concerning the involvement of U.S. government officials at the highest levels in the Far Eastern drug traffic. The Far East is the source of most heroin imported into the U.S. Colonel Gritz's objective is release of missing in action Vietnamese War veterans. The trail led him to General Kun Sa and the so-called Golden Triangle where most heroin is produced. Colonel Gritz's testimony is reproduced as Appendix O of this book. An interview tape is available from the author as detailed on page 70. Gritz claims that 900 tons of heroin and opium will enter the United States in 1987 because of the deliberate actions of elements within the U.S. government who are Kun Sa's biggest customers. Says Gritz, the facts are that for 15 years, U.S. taxpayers through legislative bodies like this committee and executive agencies such as have testified here today, have dumped hundreds of millions of dollars into drug suppression programs with Thailand and Burma which have done nothing but nourish the flow of narcotics from Asia into the United States. And more from Gritz, certain high-level Thai and Burmese officials are packing their pockets with U.S.-supplied, Bush, drug overlord. 73. Drug suppression funds. More shameful are the serious allegations raised by General Kun Sa and his staff that corrupt U.S. officials allow this travesty and in certain cases are directly involved. Here's another insight: the fact is that all of the heroin and opiates could be shut off at the Golden Triangle if America's responsible elected and appointed officials would do their job. Is the U.S. government interested, especially George Bush? I have tried, says Colonel Gritz, to cooperate with the committee and its membership. I furnished videotapes, only to be informed that the chairman has blocked their distribution. I've supplied the such letter to Vice President Bush. Page 90 of transcript in appendix. So, here we have it, A U.S. colonel who started to search for Mears ends up learning of the highest levels of government involvement with the global heroin traffic and implicates none less than Vice President Bush himself. One key observation to keep in mind is that the Bogratz evidence is consistent with the Bush benign neglect of drug interdiction. This neglect has been characterized as a fraud by none other than a former DO administrator. Independently of Colonel Gritt's activities, yet another persistent probe has been underway by philanthropist Ross Perot of Texas. Perot has probed CIA activities, allegedly linked to international drug trafficking, and in particular, a lawsuit filed by the Washington, D.C. public interest law firm, the Christie Institute. Christie has filed suit in Florida against former CIA and defense officials claiming their legal traffic in drugs. Perot comes into the picture because he took a stack of evidence to Mr. Bush in the White House. According to Time, May 4, 1987, George Bush told Perot to go to the proper authorities. Ross Perot went to FBI Director William Webster. However, the proper authorities for evidence of international drug smuggling would be Mr. Bush himself. The FBI is limited to domestic activities and has no involvement with the Far East. From the Time article it appears that George Bush gave Ross Perot the brush off. From what we know of Ross Perot, we, 74, two faces of George Bush, doubt a brush off even from a vice president will stop him for long. As we go to press we understand Ross Perot is accumulating more evidence. See the Contra, drug link. The name of George Bush turns up once again in a drug environment, this time linked to drug money allegedly used to finance the Contras freedom fighters in Nicaragua. On pages 76-78 we reproduce establishment news source reports that Bush knows, and has dealings with, a Felix Rodriguez, alias Max Gomez or Felix Gomez, a former CIA agent not to be confused with a Ramon Rodriguez, a known cocaine and money launderer now serving time for these offenses. Reportedly Felix Rodriguez of CIA asked Ramon Rodriguez to handle a $10 million cocaine deal while Felix was working for the National Security Council. Reported by CBS in West 57th Street airing on the 11th of July 1987. This is one of numerous cocaine and heroin deals linked to CIA by this CBS program. The key is that George Bush, according to the newspaper articles we reproduce here, knows and has worked with Felix Rodriguez. To be sure, Bush has his plausible denial story, but this is countered by Ramon Rodriguez's testimony, who has no reason to implicate the vice president untruthfully. CIA links to the international drug trade. For decades rumors have floated that the CIA has links to the international drug trade, that CIA buys drugs, that U.S. military and CIA-contracted planes have transported drugs into the United States. For years most of us were unable to accept these rumors, there was no hard evidence and as a hypothesis it sounded implausible. The first real break that the rumors might indeed have substance came in the Nugan Hand Bank case in 1980. On January 27, 1980, two Australian policemen found the lifeless body of Frank Nugan slumped in a 1977 Mercedes sedan parked on the highway at Lithgow, 90 miles outside Sydney. The inquest sparked several McQuins, the collapse of the Nugan Hand Bank and mountains of evidence that linked the CIA to Nugan Hand and drug smuggling. Nugan Hand has been, Bush, drug overlord. 75, described as a mammoth drug financing, money laundering, tax evading investor fraud operation based in Sydney, Australia. Mother Jones, August-September 1987. Most surprising was the revelation that Nugan Hand Bank was staffed with CIA types, beginning with Michael Hand himself, a 50% shareholder in the bank and contract agent for the CIA in Vietnam and Laos, with Walter MacDonald, former deputy director of the CIA, plus assorted generals and admirals. One of the more mystifying aspects of Nugan Hand was its intimate relations with Drug Enforcement Administration. Nugan Hand was a proven international drug operator and had offices in Chiang Mai, the hill town in Thailand known for one thing, as the last outpost before the Golden Triangle and the acknowledged center of heroin traffic. Here's how Jonathan Whitney, investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal and writing in Mother Jones' above citation describes the mystery. If it seems strange for a legitimate merchant bank to open an office in Chiang Mai, consider this. The Chiang Mai Nguyen Hand office was lodged on the same floor, in what appears to be the same office suite as the United States Drug Enforcement Agency office. The offices shared a common entrance and an internal connecting door between work areas. The dear receptionist answered Nguyen Hand's phone and took messages when the bank's representatives were out. The dear provided no explanation for how this came about. Its spokespeople in Washington have professed ignorance of the situation, and DEA agents in the field have been prevented by their superiors from discussing it with reporters. As Whitney points out, the CIA has a history of working with the Drug Enforcement Agency, but what was happening in Chiang Mai? To be sure, office space must be at a premium in a small hill town in northwest Thailand, but why would DEA share an office and receptionist in a bank, and a known drug money laundering bank at that? Even more disturbing, when CIA operatives shared a Chiang Mai office with DEA, who was director of the CIA. None other than George Bush. 76. Two Faces of George Bush. New York Times, November 13, 1986. Bush says Aldo L.S. Lundad to Contras apply for a close aide to Bush knows key figure tied to Contra aide national security advisor had served in C.Vertical.A. With man helping direct flights by Philip Shannon. Eugene Hasenfuss, an American captured after his cargo plane was downed in Nicaragua last week, said Mr. Gomez was a CLA employee and was running the supply operations to the rebels from a Salvadoran air base. Denial by agency. The Central Intelligence Agency has denied that Mr. Gomez works directly or indirectly for the agency. Mr. Fitzwater said Mr. Bush had met twice with Mr. Gomez, most recently in May. On Saturday the vice president called Mr. Gomez a patriot. Mr. Fitzwater said that the conversations in the vice president's office in the old executive office building here were brief, 10 to 15 minutes, and did not involve the Nicaraguan rebels. No talks on Contras. The conversations, the spokesman said, had been entirely related to El Salvador. He said Mr. Bush has never had any conversation of any kind about the Contras or Contra aid or Nicaragua with Mr. Gomez. The vice president, Mr. Fitzwater said, did not know then or now that Mr. Gomez might be involved in aiding the rebels. Congress has barred direct American government support of the guerrillas. President Reagan and the CIA have denied any government link to the cargo plane, which Nicaragua said was carrying military supplies to the rebels. The plane had flown from the Lopango Air Base in El Salvador. Mr. Gregg and Mr. Gomez have known each other for years and worked together at the CRL.A. Pashuklali in Vietnam, Mr. Fitzwater said. Have kept in touch. A congressional source said that, Spectalember. New York Times. Washington, October 12. Vice President Bush acknowledged today that his national security advisor had ties to a Central Intelligence Agency veteran identified as a leader of a secret effort to supply Nicaraguan rebels. But the vice president continued to deny any involvement in overseeing the supply operations to the rebels, known as Contras, who are fighting the Sandinista government of Nicaragua. Through a spokesman, the vice president said he had met twice in his office with the former CIA agent, known as Maxor Felix Gomez and as Felix Rodriguez, but only to discuss El Salvador. Worked for El Salvador. According to Mr. Bush's staff, Mr. Gomez had worked for the Salvadoran Air Force as a counterinsurgency specialist. Mr. Bush's spokesman, Marlon Fitzwater, said in an interview that Mr. Gomez had been recommended for the job by Donald R. Gregg, a former intelligence agency official who is Mr. Bush's national security advisor. Bush, drug overlord. During the Vietnam War, Mr. Gomez served in Air America, an airline once owned by the CLA. According to the vice president's office, Mr. Gregg and Mr. Gomez have stayed in touch but not to discuss the Nicaraguan rebels. Gregg had said he had no knowledge of anything involving Contras, Mr. Fitzwater said. Neither the vice president nor anyone on his staff is directly or indirectly coordinating an operation in Central America. Mr. Fitzwater said Mr. Gregg was out of town today and could not be reached. There was no answer at Mr. Gregg's home telephone. A specialist in Far Eastern matters while in the CIA, Mr. Gregg once served as the agency's station chief in Seoul, South Korea. Bush, a former director, Mr. Fitzwater said he did not know if Mr. Gomez was in the agency in 1976 and 1977, when Mr. Bush was the director of Central Intelligence under President Ford. At a news conference Saturday in Charleston, SC, Mr. Bush strongly denied he had anything to do with directing secret flights to drop military equipment to the Contras. "It's absolutely, totally untrue," he said of the reports. "One can deny it unequivocally." Mr. Bush was campaigning in South Carolina for Republican candidates. He said he met with Mr. Gomez in connection with El Salvador in January 1985 and last May. "One know Felix Gomez, I know Felix Gomez," he said. "I met with him twice. Saw him at a political event. Shook hands with him a mud ton. He's a patriot." The vice president said Mr. Gomez's current role was to help the government of El Salvador put down an insurrection, put down a Marxist revolution, and it is the policy of the United States to support that. This man, having served in Vietnam, is in 77, expert in that. "The only discussions one have ever had with Felix related to El Salvador," he said. "To the best of my knowledge, this man is not working for the United States government." While denying any improper link with Mr. Gomez or supply operations to aid the Contras, the vice president restated his support for the Nicaraguan rebels and private American efforts to help them. "Rebel victories," he said, "are clearly in the best interest of the United States. And we believe that firmly. I'll think it's fine that volunteers do this," he said of the private efforts. Despite White House denials, members of Congress strongly suggest there is evidence that the United States was involved in a secret supply effort that included the cargo plane shot down in Nicaragua last Sunday. 78. Two Faces of George Bush. San Francisco Chronicle, June 8, 1987. Jack Anderson Bush linked to Iran affair. Vice President George Bush has become deeply implicated in the Iran-Contra arms scandal because of internal memos described as very damaging by congressional sources. The way things work in Washington, Bush's national security advisor, Donald Gregg, will pay the price. Our White House sources predict that Gregg will be the next official forced to resign as a result of the Senate House Select Committee's investigation. Several White House aides have urged Gregg to leave ever since his dealings with former CIA agent Felix Rodriguez came under Justice Department scrutiny late last year. Rodriguez was an integral part of the White House's clandestine aid program to the Contras. Rodriguez testified at the congressional hearing about a meeting with Gregg last August in which the secret supply of arms to Iran was discussed. Committee sources tell us a secret memo implicates Gregg and by extrapolation Bush, to a much greater degree in the secret Contra aid program. The committee is keeping a tight lid on another memo which sources tell us involves Bush in the scandal much deeper than has been established so far. Bush has claimed only peripheral involvement in the arms for hostages transaction with Iran. He either doesn't remember THMGS, or recalls them far more favorably to himself than others do. For example, on December 29, Bush was disingenuous at best or untruthful at worst in an interview with the Tower Commission's General Counsel, W. Clark McFadden. 11. Bush provided an astonishing account of a meeting he had in Jerusalem last July 29 with Amir Amna, counterterrorism advisor to then Prime Minister Shimon Peres. Memo written by Bush's Chief of Staff, Craig Fuller, who was there, makes it abundantly clear that the meeting dealt exclusively with the arms for hostages swap. Fuller wrote that NR asked for a direction as to whether the items arms requested would be delivered in separate shipments or whether we would continue to press for the release of the hostages prior to delivering the items in the amount agreed to previously. The references to items and units referred to U.S. anti-tank tow Russells. Yet despite this detail of what was discussed, this one's how the Tower Commission discounted Bush's interview with its counsel. Vice President Bush related that this discussion with Mr. was generally about counterterrorism. There was no discussion of specifics of arms going to the Iranians. Today 5 column was written by Jack Anderson and Dale Van Arna. Bush, drug overlord. 79. To heighten the mystery, U.S. official statements reported a broader remote from on-the-spot actions. For example, if we look at the Bangkok Post, the leading English-language paper in Thailand, we find headlines like U.S. calls for no mercy in drug war, Thai efforts good but restrained March 6, 1987. This headed an article reporting on the testimony of Diaz John Lawn before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Yet just a few months before, the same newspaper January 23, 1987 had reported General Kuntz as follows: Kuntz predicts drug output rise. This claim was made openly to a group of Thai and foreign newsmen. So what we find overseas is clearly different to what the U.S. officials tell Congress and what is happening in reality. No effort has been made to extradite Kuntz from his territory. Heroin production in protected mobile laboratories expands, but back in the U.S. the DEA and Vice President Bush claim success. Obviously Bush as an anti-drug trade enforcer is abysmally inefficient at the very least. There are certainly grounds for impartial investigation of the Bush role in the dramatic rise of drug imports in his tenure as the highest U.S. official in charge of drug interdiction. What we find is Congress and the establishment media hard at work burying the evidence. A little further probing uncovers even closer Bush links to drug use. On one side are tantalizing but insignificant links. A very minor episode occurred in 1985 when 2 micrograms of cocaine were found on a $20 bill in the possession of Jeb Bush, son of George Bush, then chairman of Dade County, Florida Republican Party. This turned up as part of a test of $20 bills circulating in southern Florida. Commented Jeb Bush, "Since it's not part of my real world, I find it difficult to believe that cocaine is that pervasive." Closer to George Bush, this author was told by a Chernobyl engineer that she was present in a room in Houston, Texas in 1977 when Senator Bush had used cocaine. The informant refuses to go on record. She insists it was Senator Bush, whereas George Bush has only run for the Senate, never elected. This is not acceptable as evidence, but insistence, for no. 80. Two Faces of George Bush. Political reason of such a bizarre episode is puzzling. Yet the Bush real world does have definite cocaine links. On May 11, 1987, Spanish police in Madrid arrested Conan David Owen on charges of being a drug courier. Owen was arrested at Barcelona airport with a suitcase containing 2 kilograms of cocaine. The arrest was pursued by Spanish police and the Drug Enforcement Agency. The Vice President's office in Washington, D.C., immediately intervened on behalf of Conan David Owen on the grounds Owen had been duped into carrying the suitcase through Spanish customs. 2 kilos equals 4 pounds, not an insignificant amount. Would you take a suitcase through customs with an unknown 4 pounds inside? Owen was on the Bush personal staff in 1984. Setup is less likely than drug run. But is this degree of naivety likely in a loot house aid? We suspect that Owen had knowledge of the contents of his suitcase. It was arranged so that plausible denial of set-up could be claimed if the scheme was uncovered, as it was. Reported New York Times May 12, 1987. Why would Vice President Bush come to the assistance of a White House drug smuggler caught red-handed? That's just as inexplicable as building a 2-lane paved highway into the Golden Triangle or allowing the DEA to share an office with a notorious international drug smuggling ring. In brief, there are grounds to ask tough questions of George Bush and his role in drug interdiction. Chapter 12 Bush, the politician. The recent Iran-Contra hearings support the view that Mr. Reagan is a superb politician. The smoking gun of Irangate has not at least had time of going to press been traced directly into the White House where Mr. Bush has charge of anti-terrorist affairs. Yet there is a widespread undercurrent of opinion that perhaps Reagan is merely a front man for the Eastern establishment biding its time to put their own man, George Bush, into the presidential slot. This view found accidental support in a remarkable news item in issue number 5 of the American Pistol and Rifle Association newsletter. This quoted James Baker, White House Chief of Staff and an old Bush man, as follows: during a candid interview at a nearby video arcade where he frequently goes to unwind, Baker said the president doesn't understand our program and one's increasingly difficult to work with. I probably shouldn't say this, he told reporters, but on too many issues he has his own agenda. That doesn't fit in with our team concept. I like the president personally, but I must consider the good of the administration. The APRA newsletter commented, who elected James Baker? This supports the evidence that a secret establishment does exist and the makes and executes policy. Certainly in the Iran-Contra hearings it was clearly evident that Mr. Reagan was extraordinarily out of touch with day-to-day operations, to a degree that caused disbelief among a majority of American citizens. And it is generally known that Reagan prefers a relaxed management-style leaving policy and its implementation to subordinates. And Bush is the senior of these subordinates. This places Bush in an unusually good position to take over the reins. 82. Two Faces of George Bush. On the other hand, Bush has a problem with the press, for several reasons. The dislike may be rooted in a 1984 event when Bush bounced reporters off his plane, or the attempt to conceal troubles with the IRS, or perhaps because Bush is perceived by the press as well as the public as a wimp, a phony, a weak man posing as a strong man. Whatever the reason, Bush is no press favorite. In describing Bush, commentators have used language far stronger than any in this book. For example, smarmiest Lars Erik Nelson in New York Daily News raises the question of whether or not he ever had any principles. Tom Wicker, The New York Times: the unpleasant sound Bush is emitting as he traipses from one conservative gathering to another is a thin, tinny art, the sound of a lapdog. George F. Will: The Washington Post: in the Bush-Ferrara meeting, the super-credentialed Brahman Yali behaved like a frightened oaf, while the Italian-American ex-housewife displayed calm, breeding and self-possession. Morton Kondrack: The New Republic: the central issue for nomination 1's the fate of Bush within the conservative wing of the Republican Party. For 1/2 century the debate within the Republican Party has been between the Rockefeller Republicans representing the Eastern Wall Street New England wing of the party and the anti-establishment conservative wing. Bush belongs unmistakably to the former, while the Republican Party itself has been, at least since 1964, moving in the anti-establishment direction. Reacting on this image, a book co-authored by George Bush and his former speechwriter Victor Gold, Looking Forward, The George Bush Story, takes issue with the critics, and not too successfully. Bush avers he is not a preppy, yet what else is he with the private school, Ivy League background? Bush states his parents came from the Midwest and came close to staying in Tennessee before Prescott Bush decided to move to New England. This does not face the question of where the family did actually reside, which is Connecticut. Bush, the politician. 83. Then we have the feeble portraits to demonstrate that Bush is just like the rest of us, that is, he was carried home drunk from a Texas Christmas party. To which one is tempted to say, so what? In brief, a studied 3-year literary effort to dismiss the Bush cucumber sandwich image falls flat. The more Bush tries to dismiss his origins and his personality, the more the effort falls flat. Bush would be far better advised to be what he is, admit it and go for whatever objective he has in mind. Can Bush be elected president? Yes, but largely by default for want of a more readily identifiable candidate. Bush has one great asset. As vice president he has played second string to Reagan most effectively. Only on his hasty Mideast trip to induce the Arabs to raise the price of crude oil has Bush parted company with the Reagan administration. Consequently Bush has great name recognition. But he also has a giant question mark over his head. The question mark was well expressed by Mike McLean, a Louisiana GOP operative: he's running good because of name recognition. But there's nothing in Bush's record to show he can get elected to anything. And down the line, when he gets more exposure, I think he'll lose ground pretty fast in the South. I view him as part and parcel of the Eastern establishment. Another skeptic is John Alderson Sr., chairman of the 1980 and 1984 Reagan campaigns in Virginia. Under ordinary circumstances Bush is not electable. He will have to answer for everything the Democrats are going to try to hang on the administration, from the Iran-Contra affair to the unanswered problem of the deficit. Alderson stated he was unable to get a fix on just who George Bush was and pointed to the recent Gridiron dinner where Bush himself had touched on the sensitive issue. "I have opinions of my own, strong opinions, but I don't always agree with them." That sounds much too much like the old political double talk for most voters, and reinforces the wimp image widely. 84. Two Faces of George Bush, held. So what is Bush's political problem? It's not new for a politician to be called unelectable. Just about every presidential candidate since Eisenhower has been called unelectable. What is different for Bush is a wimp image that just won't go away, and seemingly every Bush political event reinforces the image. The man was even stupid enough to joke about it at the Gridiron dinner in 1987. There is another factor, only occasionally touched upon in public, that is, that Bush is an honest-to-goodness member of that old discredited Eastern liberal establishment. Ideologically he is more at home with Sloan Coffin, his fellow Skull and Bones initiate, the McBundys, Dean Nixon and the rest of the crowd of unelected and somewhat vaguely stupid elitists. 20 years ago this was not really an election factor. The dissidents stayed home and showed up on the rolls as not voting. Today the not voting crowd has grown so that the elections themselves become something of a sham. When turnout gets down to the 4,050% range, something is wrong with the electoral process. That something is the quality of the candidates. There is no question that Paul Laxalt could give Bush a real run for his money, even Bush supporters agree on that. But Laxalt has the Las Vegas organized crime taint hanging over his head, rightly or wrongly, and that will not go over too well in the Bible Belt South, already staggering under the shock of Jim and Tammy Backer and other errant evangelical ministers. Dole could give Bush a run. 1F Bush makes more mistakes, but Dole is much too close to certain multinational businessmen with more money than good sense when it comes to the Soviet Union. Dwayne Andreas, who has replaced Armand Hammer as Russia's favorite capitalist, is financing Dole, and Dole and his wife were indiscreet enough to spend 1986 Christmas vacation with Dwayne Andreas. Dwayne's juvenile naivety towards things Soviet can rub off on Dole already with a shaky image on Soviet defense. So Bush could win by default. Not a promising prospect, 8 years of an Eastern establishment liberal wimp. 900 tons of heroin and opium will enter the free world from Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle this year. The reason is because U.S. taxpayer dollars and American equipment have been used to construct a new road that will allow narcotics to pour out of General Kuntz's Shan territories rather than trickle out by horse. And mules has been the case until the beginning of this year. Last year 600 tons of opiates trafficked from this area. Press reports included as part of this statement argue that it is logistically impossible to increase the output to 900 tons. The new road, capable of easily handling 10-ton truck convoys, signal not only the capability, but the reality. The disappointing fact is that this new artery was constructed by the Thai government using money, manpower, time and materials furnished by our drug suppression funds. Moreover, there are serious implications that elements within the U.S. government are Kuntz's biggest customers. The facts are that for 15 years U.S. taxpayers, through legislative bodies like this committee and executive agencies such as have testified here today, have dumped hundreds of millions of dollars into drug suppression programs within Thailand and Burma, which have done nothing but nourish the flow of narcotics from Asia into the United States. The proof is statistically clear. 15 years ago the flow of opiates was 60 tons, this year it will approach or exceed 900 tons. The reasons, though multifaceted, boil down to one word: money. Certain high-level Thai and Burmese officials are packing their pockets with U.S.-supplied drug suppression funds, 87, political payoffs, and other spin-off profits like the thousands of teak trees felled during the Kunz Road effort. Kunz has no outlet for teak, but it is a protected and highly valued commodity in Thailand. More shameful are the serious allegations raised by General Kuntsa and his staff that corrupt U.S. officials allow this travesty and in certain cases are directly involved. After meeting with General Kuntsa and others, I am convinced that a secret combination exists today within the U.S. government that was officially germinated during the Nixon, Vietnam years and has, through illicit drug profits, propagated itself today into a self-serving righteous monster of global proportions. I believe Ed Wilson was a member of this combination and that his activities represent only one of many tentacles. I believe the Contra-Iran situation is merely another visible lesion that has emerged from this extra-governmental organism. I say would be righteous because those within this secret combination I believe honestly think they are serving America by offering an established model of sabotage, subversion, and assassination to areas threatened by communism. They are in existence because normal government process is too cumbersome, time-consuming and oft-times impotent. These persons who are intelligent and well-seated in our governmental structure think they are smarter than our elected officials and can expedite accomplishment of national objectives. They have funded their efforts through drug trafficking because of a 1960s nonsense that anyone who would use opiates is animalistic and the USA doesn't really care about them. They began their drug dealing in Southeast Asia as a means to fund the secret war in Laos and Cambodia that Congress was officially unaware of. Besides my personal experiences, all of these conclusions are spelled out in the book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. I have good reason to believe that after President Nixon got the U.S. out of Vietnam with honor, while bringing home all the POWs in 1973 that either were his concurrents, or on the initiative of those best and brightest included within the President's 40, the war continued to be fought through. 88. Two Faces of George Bush, Project Phoenix. The insiders knew the North Vietnamese would not abide by the Triaccord and continued to consolidate their position in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Since the war was over there was no congressional funding and homegrown drug trafficking offered the most expedient solution. Ideally the communist takeover in 1975 would fall like a house of cards since the infrastructure would be eliminated by extreme prejudice through the Phoenix operation. Even so, an estimated 150,000 non-military persons were terminated. The program failed to meet the expectations of those in charge. Next, I believe the Phoenix model was moved to help stabilize a toppling Shah who happened to be close to the administration, and to people in the secret combination society, many of whom held high positions within the executive branch. The Shah fell. By this time the model was self-perpetuating. Rather than shut down after failing in Iran, there was a refocus on the building communist threat in Central America. The Contra-Iran Oliver North White House disclosures are only protrusions that have become visible because of the extent and intensity of this para-government organization. Even as these hearings are underway, representatives of this secret combination are at work in the Philippines, offering anti-communist solutions to that struggling democracy. I believe that, as years and changing administrations have gradually thinned the society's active duty status within the U.S. government, I believe those who still steer the society have become more self-serving, making huge personal profits under the guise of fighting worldwide communism. Further, I believe they are maximizing their influence to protect those of the Brotherhood who still hold active office in the government. I have been told for years that U.S. POWs would never be allowed to return because they were directly related to illegal drug trafficking by U.S. officials. Until May of 1987, I thought this absurd. Now, after 8 years in the POW Southeast Asian arena, I clearly can see what was hidden except to those more sensitive to power politics than myself. The reason we have met the enemy and he is U.S. in our efforts to return, Appendix A, 89, POWs while they are still alive is simple. When POWs are returned, the first demand by the American people will be to examine those within the government responsible for their return. America will want to know why these individuals failed in their official capacities, why the burden fell on the private sector, And what took so long if the power issue is truly top national priority as designated by President Reagan? Upon investigation it will be revealed that responsible officials were more interested in actuating their secret society than accounting for our power and mia. The fact is that all of the heroin and opiates could be shut off at the Golden Triangle if America's responsible elected and appointed officials would do their job. General Kanzar is recognized as the drug kingpin and controls the Golden Triangle with a well-disciplined army of 40,000 Shan soldiers. He has stated to me before 3 other American witnesses on videotape that he greatly desires to stop the drug trafficking, but we won't let him. He has promised that if we will give him any economic alternative, he will not just stem, but stop the flow of narcotics through his areas of control. He has said, for example, that for any tenth the money we now give the Burmese for drug suppression turned into economic aid and crop substitution, he will use his force to enforce what we cannot and have not. In addition, Kanzar has stipulated that the Burmese must be stopped from using the 12 Bell helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft given them by the U.S. to spray the Shan state people, animals, food and water with Agent Orange and herbicides. All that I have presented thus far is backed up by written and recorded documents made available to the committee. It has been reported to me by committee personnel that Kanzar has made these offers before. They say the CIA has expressed doubt and mistrust that Kanzar will carry out his part of the bargain. I and 3 other Americans have met with Kanzar. We all believe him to be sincere. Certainly in view of the dismal failure of the CIA and DEA to slow, stop or even deter the flood of drugs from the Golden Triangle, it seems that a change in dynamics is in order. Especially since Kanzar has directly implicated persons with them. The CIA has some 92 faces of George Bush, of his best customers. The videotapes show testimony of a frustrated medical doctor who, under orders from Kanzar, did everything from offer radio links to Kanzar's headquarters to present a horse that might be used to alert DEA of drug movements. The low-level agents supported these initiatives, but in every case they were rejected at DEA headquarter levels. I have strived at the invitation of the executive branch for 8 years to convince political skeptics that American powers are alive in the hands of communist forces in Laos and Vietnam. One abhor drugs and dopes that are uses. Yet in the past 2 weeks I've been told by committee staff and others that federal sources and a Los Angeles State Department employee have said that I am a drug trafficker, and I will be in prison before July 4th. I know this level of federal employee would never make such slanderous statements unless encouraged by higher-ups. While following the classic model of deny infame or divert, it is disappointing that law enforcement agencies would reveal such low-life practices as directly as they have, and then avoid comment when confronted. I have tried in every way to cooperate with the committee and its membership. I've furnished videotapes, only to be informed that the chairman has blocked their distribution. I've supplied the such letter to Vice President Bush, and requested a written transcript of the file from which Kanzar's secretary read from. I received a letter in the mail last week. It was from Kanzar. The stapled and sealed envelope had been opened. Inside, the pamphlet, which had also been stapled shut, has been opened and the contents removed. I had asked Kanzar to translate his record, sign it himself with 2 additional witnesses. Was assured this document was part of the opened package. I have requested my contacts furnish me with a fax of their copy. It serves to supplement in writing the verbal and video accounts. I'm disillusioned that this committee, which represents the interest of 240 million Americans in controlling illegal drug trafficking, would take such a negative and skeptical position on such a critical issue as Kanzar's proposal and my deliverance of the information he gave us. I've been told that, Appendix A, 91, I must sell my case to you. Facts are, I am a citizen who has been twice to see a warlord who is recognized as the world's most powerful heroin kingpin. This person has shown statistically that our 15-year-old drug suppression program is, at best, dumb by anyone's standards. At best we have millions of U.S. tax dollars being mishandled. One recipient has made use of U.S. assets to build a major road, and secures that road from outside infiltration, 900 tons of opiates entering the free world, rampant corruption of allied officials. At worst, in addition to the best case, we have officials within the USO who won't, as Kansah says, let him get out of the drug business, because they are his biggest buyers. Your business is representing American interest in drug control. You greatly influence how our tax dollars are used and how well the enforcement agencies do their job. My business is bringing home POWs while they are still alive. Neither one of us has been able to make much headway because I'm convinced there are persons within the government that are opposing us both. If POWs came home, the resulting investigation will expose their drug involvement. If the drugs are stopped, their source of income dries up. I agree that communism threatens the liberty of free people everywhere, but in my opinion drugs are even a bigger and more immediate threat. To fuel these self-righteous freedom fighters with drug money is to steal, cheat, and mislead every American taxpayer, and circumnavigate the greatest governmental system in the world. While it may appear slow, and at times fickle and indecisive, still ours is the greatest government in the world. There aren't boatloads of Americans headed for the Soviet Union. I believe our system was divinely inspired. I believe it will work despite any shortcomings. As a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with temple endowments, I raise my hand to the square and swear before God, angels, and you as witnesses, that this statement is the absolute truth as I know it. I hope you can swear before God that you will execute the responsibilities to your constituents with all honesty and thoroughly investigating the proposal for eliminating all drug trafficking from the Golden Triangle, and seeing to the objective investigation and 92 Two Faces of George Bush prosecution of any American officials found to be guilty of maliciously dealing in drugs. I personally don't believe the Americans named by Kansah as conspirators in traffickings could pass an honest security background check. I believe if you do your job as our representative body, you will uncover and topple those members of this secret combination like a line of dominoes. If you give this hearing only a cameo appearance, the combination will be strengthened and our nation could be in for a period like the Vietnam era. Your positive attention to this matter should also speed the safe return of our POs. I believe we can stop the heroin and opium by working with Kansah instead of against him. At worst we lose 10% of the Burmese socialist state suppression funds. You don't have to be from Las Vegas to recognize Kansah's offer as a good bet. I believe in him and that he will keep his word. We can't hardly afford not to take the chance. I believe the American public would be outraged to discover we bypassed such an opportunity because people who are suspect as traffickers say they don't trust Kansah. Their line should be added to other greats such as, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, and your check is in the mail. The body of this statement contains a chronology of events. I have attached germane documents that attest to the allegations made in the videotapes.